Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Sandra Edmonds Crew, Dean of the Howard University School of Social Work. I am so delighted to have you join our day two of our third symposium. We are excited about the presentations that you will have today, and we encourage you to listen to the presentations or view the presentations from yesterday. There's an excellent linkage with the two sets of presentations. Today, again, we continue the dialogue about social work, white supremacy, and racial justice, addressing racism from within the profession and also looking specifically at the topics that we are focused on today. So today we began to have the dialogue about Black women, the family police, and the fight for liberation. Now, Dr. Anna Julia Cooper is widely acknowledged for her quote, "When and Where I Enter," and that focuses on Black women, how we show up within society. That is a quote found in her 1892 book, Voices from the South. Now, she's joined in her call by Sojourner Truth, who states, "Ain't I a woman?" Again, a reference to the plight of Black women in America. And yes, my students at Howard know this. I am a fan of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman would remind us to reach for the stars and change the world. And Howard's founding dean, Dr. Annabelle Burns Lindsay, leaves us with a legacy of believing that we are indeed second to none. Again, I pause to really thank my fellow sponsors in this seminar that we're holding today, and I am so excited that we're able to continue this. Reckoning with racism and white supremacy requires that we take a deeper dive and look at the experiences of Black women who have been on the front line of racism and sexism, womanism and feminism. We have mourned the loss of children to the injustices that were so passionately raised by the Black Lives Matter protests. Like many of you, when I witnessed George Floyd dying and crying out for his mother, I not only heard him, I felt the pain. As a mother of two sons, I bear witness to the constant angst that we experience going about normal routines of life. Things such as driving, jogging, walking, bird watching. These are the things that we really need to be mindful of as we hear the presentations that we are about to experience. Today, as Black women, we enter into the context of rampant racism, white supremacy, and gender inequality. We wrestle with the notion of radical social justice and anti racism and how we fit into that picture. Our panel today will discuss specifically, as I said, Black women, the family police, and the fight for liberation. In each of these presentations, you will be introduced to critical thinking regarding the inextricable link between true liberation and the plight of success of African American women. You will think about our roles in society and how we are integrated into the profession and our roles of motherhood and more. The scholars also ask us to think about a new paradigm, to move more toward the desired state of liberation. One such paradigm that they have mentioned is Afrofuturism. So, this requires that we really examine new ways of thinking about being Black and being a woman within the profession and within the society. A former colleague of mine, the renowned scholar, the late Dr. Ronald Walters, would always say When you're writing, when you're thinking, ask the question, interrogate yourself. What does this have to do with the liberation of Black people? The liberation of Black people is inextricably linked to the liberation of Black women. So today we have the experience of the presenters that will examine this question through their various lens. So we have presenters that will talk about Black women be knowing, a guide for dismantling white supremacy through the fight for reproductive justice and social work, research, practice, and advocacy. That panel will be led by Dr. By Ms. Crystal Hayes, by Dr. Michelle Eggers, and Dr. Catherine Lieball. We will have a second panel that looks at Black Mothers Matter, reimagining child protection and a state that supports Black mothers. That will be led by Natani Eddy, as well as Marcia Hopkins and Dominique Michael. We will end with a panel, Imagining a New World Through Afrofuturism, a response to racism within the social work profession, Lakendra Mitchell Dove, Dr. Dove. So these three presentations will give us the lens that we need to work through this. And so with that, I now move to the introduction of my first panel. Good afternoon or get morning wherever you are. So we're close to afternoon everywhere now, so I can be comfortable with that. Thank you so much for joining us today. The panel will be Black Women Be Knowing, a guide for dismantling white supremacy through the fight for reproductive justice in social work, research, practice, and advocacy. We are joined by Crystal Hayes. Crystal has joined us, Ms. Hayes. Crystal has a broad intellectual and political social justice commitment, and her research interests run deep in this area. She was born and raised in New York City at the end of the civil rights movement, on the cusp of the Black Power movement, coming of age during the third wave of feminism. Living by Audre Lorde's quote, silence will not protect you. She has always tried to use her voice in service to others to tell the truth and about racialized sexism and forms of oppression. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. So I'm excited to add the doctor to your name. That will come shortly. We're also joined by Dr. Michelle Eggers. Dr. Eggers, Michelle's interests focus on human rights and social justice related to reproductive justice, environmental racism and justice, indigenous and women's rights, and also globalization, Latin America, resistance, and critical social work. In addition, her experiences have been working with adolescents and women in a variety of settings, such as street outreach, community health clinics, outpatient day treatment programs, schools, and colleges. She is currently working on a book or manuscript on reproductive justice in Chile. And lastly, on our panel is Catherine Lieball. Dr. Lieball is an associate professor of social work and human rights at the University of Connecticut and the director of the Human Rights Institute. She received her doctorate in cultural anthropology at the University of Washington. Since 2007, she has taught at the School of Social Work and the Human Rights Institute, specializing in human rights, human, human, human. Well, I'll just leave that word alone. And migration. humanitarianism and migration, and social welfare in the Middle East and the United States. Her scholarship has addressed women's and children's rights movement in Turkey, international non-governmental organizational advocacy on behalf of Iraqi and Syrian refugees, and the localization of human rights norms and practices in the United States. It is now my pleasure to introduce their presentations for you. So take it away, colleagues.
Oh, wow. So thank you so very much. And I will be sure to keep the academic jargon to a minimum. I really believe that if my grandmother can't understand what I'm doing it the wrong way. But first, I just want to say a deep gratitude and thank you to the conference organizers and my fellow co-presenters here on this panel and all the presentations and panels that have been a part of this really amazing symposium. So thank you to the organizers for your vision and thoughtfulness and bringing us together to talk about, how social work can be a part of dismantling white supremacy. But again, I want to say another just special thank you to my co-presenters here, Michelle and Kathy. Kathy is the chair of my dissertation committee, so we see each other a lot these days. But I'm really grateful to the both of you for being willing to build community with me, this intellectual community with me, for being in solidarity with me, across race, across borders, but always in the interest of building a world where people live free and with dignity. So I thank you for that. And as always, I want to shout out to all the Black feminists, reproductive justice and birth justice, epistemologists and organizers and scholars whose work deeply inspires me and inspires my own work and provides me with a genealogy, right? And a critique of power and identity and the world around me, right? And all the ways that their theories are rooted in the struggle and resilience of Black women. So I definitely want to shout them out. But first, let me say a quick note about our title. Black Women Be and Been Knowing is an African-American woman's proverb. It signifies the intersectional lives that Black women negotiate on a daily basis and the ways in which they fight to tell the truth about their experiences, despite the world's refusal to listen and silence them. Black women have known for a long time, as we will demonstrate in this presentation, that issues of power, freedom, justice, and the basic human ability to control one's destiny are all inscribed on the body and embodied in the body. The struggle for citizenship, for example, which is at the core of all of our struggles for social justice and freedom, was a battle that was first waged in this country over the freedom of enslaved Black people. Freedom has always been described and embodied as white, and it has always been legitimated and affirmed through white supremacy in our institutions and in our culture. This is why our paper starts with this African-American woman's proverb. We want to amplify Black women's voices, the way that they resist and struggle for freedom, as well as their knowledge production, theories, and vision for a just and free world. We believe they are at the core of defining freedom because of the history of Black women's bodies, which have been forcefully used to reproduce slavery in the interests of maintaining white supremacy in this country. So I had a slide here for acknowledgements, but I don't know if you guys can see it here. Let me try to go back. Okay, great. So, and as always, we want to show love and respect for the land that once belonged to Indigenous people, but was violently stolen and then used to enslave Black people. This history connects us to this land, it connects our struggle, and it connects our communities in some deep and profound ways. So full disclaimer, people who know me personally and intellectually know that I am unequivocally a Black feminist. And when I think about Black feminism, particularly Black feminism as a praxis, I think about this particular Audre Lorde quote: "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are different from my own." While we are very excited to be here today, we are also very aware that presenting together on a panel that focuses on Black women exclusively as a mixed race panel risks some decentering of Black women's voices. So we were very conscious of that risk, right? And we gave it some serious consideration and decided to move forward anyway with a clear commitment to our values, to place Black women's knowledge and voices and their lived experiences at the center of our work here, and other women of color. We commit to centering their voices while still being in solidarity with other women of color, right? Michelle is going to come in later in the presentation and talk about women in the global South, but we do it in ways that highlights the different ways in which our resistance is tied together, because we recognize that being in solidarity with one another, right, is how we get free ultimately. And so one strategy that we decided on to help minimize the risk of decentering Black women's voices is in my role. I have a leadership role in the paper presentation, and I'll also have a leadership role in this presentation today. So in keeping in the spirit of centering the voices of Black women, I want to remind us to cite Black women in our work. Cite Black Women is an actual movement in response to the fact that Black women scholars are rarely, if ever, cited or referenced in scholarly resources in the academy. This is despite the fact that Black women are citable in all disciplines, fields, and genres, and especially in their own lived experiences. Yet Black women remain overwhelmingly the least cited or referenced in scholarly research. So remember that if we are going to ever decolonize social work, decolonize the academy, decolonize the ways in which we do the work that we do, we need to be sure to decolonize our citational practices as well. I want to give a special shout to the Black feminist scholar and anthropologist, Dr. Christian Smith, who is the founder of the Cite Black Women hashtag. And she also has a podcast titled Cite Black Women, which I follow, which is phenomenal. So I encourage you all to do it. But I want to shout her out and say, just a special thank you for helping us to think critically about our own citational practices in the academy. So I want to pause for a second, and I want you all to digest this image here. What if we lived in a just and free world? Our presentation is not a traditional academic presentation, so we won't do things like center methodology or analysis. We'll do that in a paper. Here we want to highlight the stories that give breadth and meaning to reproductive justice, while also giving a brief overview of the themes that we will cover in the paper. So this is an image of Sierra. She was just 6 months pregnant when she joined the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, D.C. in response to the police killing last summer of George Floyd. Her sign reads, "We are not carrying for 9 months, then struggling for 9 hours, just for you to kneel on their necks for 9 minutes." What we try to do in our paper is connect the ways that Sierra connects these struggles together to reproductive justice. Sierra's statement here is a powerful reminder that this work is always about responding to state violence and controlling one's destiny, which I'll say more about in a minute. So briefly, what we attempt to do in our paper is do exactly what Sierra is doing here. Sync these different forms of oppression together, and we link them to white supremacy through a conversation about Black Lives Matter, through a conversation about borders and immigration, through a conversation about environmental justice and police violence and imprisonment. But today, for the purposes of this particular presentation, we'll focus on state violence against communities of color, both local and in the global South. We know that state violence is a tool of white supremacy. For the better part of a century, white violence, police brutality, and mass incarceration have been the weapons of choice of white supremacy aimed at Black communities and other communities of color. They have been used to literally destroy the way that we make meaning of family and the way that we make meaning of community. I was recently reading a report on mass incarceration, and it says that 1 in 4 Black millennials had an incarcerated loved one before they even turned 18. And for those millennials born in the early 1990s, the rate is 1 in 3. So what is social work to do about any of this, right? We want part of this presentation to be a somewhat interactive. So we know we'll have an opportunity to answer some of your questions, but we have a question for you. As you listen to the course of this presentation, we want you to be thinking about, when was a reproductive choice made for you? How was that choice made for you? And in what ways, as a profession, as our social work profession, do we make reproductive choices for our clients and their communities every single day? I think it's important for us to go back to the genealogy, right, of reproductive justice, because we'll get some of our solutions and answers to those questions by going back to the genealogy. Loretta Ross is pictured here because she's part of this powerful genealogy, right? She's one of the founders of the reproductive justice movement. She helped to coin the term with 11 other Black women in 1994 at the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance Conference in Chicago. They did this in response to Bill Clinton's administration's proposed healthcare reform at the time. His healthcare reform excluded reproductive healthcare. Can you imagine? So they challenged him and his administration to include an anti-racist social justice lens that addressed all the ways that Black women don't have access to the necessary resources to make healthy decisions, like culturally competent and responsive healthcare, safe and affordable housing, jobs with a livable wage, education, healthy food and water, etc. The genealogy of this work begins with the conversation that all of our rights at all points are limited by our material conditions, which in a white supremacist society is always shaped by race and gender. So I'm going to read a quick quote from Loretta from her book that's pictured here, Reproductive Justice, an Introduction. It's actually a primer on reproductive justice that I highly recommend folks read. The case for reproductive justice makes another basic claim, she says. Access to these material resources, the one that I just mentioned, is justified on the grounds that safe and dignified fertility management, childbirth, and parenting together constitute a fundamental human right. Reproductive justice uses a human rights framework to draw attention to and resist laws and public and corporate policies based on race, racial and gender and class prejudices. So let's go back to Sierra for a moment. She powerfully articulated the connections between BLM, police brutality, and reproductive justice when she held up that sign that said, "We are not carrying for 9 months," right? Being able to parent the children you have with dignity is at the core of reproductive justice philosophy. And when we live in a culture, in a world where families are witnessing the daily violence of their children, it's really difficult for us to imagine, what does a society even look like where people aren't constantly having their reproductive rights threatened. The ability to control one's destiny as Black people, Indigenous people, and all marginalized people depends on these material conditions, the material conditions of people's lives, which includes a focus on things like sterilization projects, putting people in cages, violence at the border, separating children from their families, and all those systems that wield power and control over people in ways that strip them of their power to self-determine their lives, their communities. Yesterday, the House passed the George Floyd police reform bill that will hold police accountable, for example, for using deadly force. It's now in the Senate up for vote. But I say this to say that despite the fact that police reform and reforming the criminal legal system is taking place in politics and in movements, it still continues to exclude the experiences of Black women. While the George Floyd bill is a good thing that we all support, we fail to tell the true story, the full story of how police brutality harms our communities when we exclude Black women and their experiences. Breonna Taylor deserves justice too. Unfortunately, justice for Breonna and Black women like her remain elusive in our culture. Breonna's mother, I remember listening to her at a press conference. She once said at a rally that she prayed really hard that her daughter wouldn't die from COVID because Breonna was an essential worker on the front line. But what she also imagined too, and lots of Black families and Black mamas and dads, worry about is whether or not their children will make it home, right? Breonna was killed by a different pandemic, the pandemic of state-sanctioned police violence. So when we connect repro justice to Breonna and to George and to others, we begin to understand that their killings is a crisis of reproductive justice. Being denied the ability, for example, to have a full life with complex experiences, just like every other human being, is a human right that we all deserve, yet regularly denied to Black people, particularly Black women. So I'll just say this final thing here, because one of the other things that we touch on in the paper is thinking about reproductive justice as a praxis and not just a theory, right? So when we think about it as a praxis, right, we have to think about the ways in which we embody the values of reproductive justice and how we embody those values in ways that it shapes our policies and our engagement with one another. So this is a picture of Corinne Gaines and Marissa Prezi. Marissa and I worked together at the Prison Birth Project in Western Massachusetts a few years ago before they closed. And I interviewed Marissa as part of a pilot study that I was doing and looking at reproductive justice issues for incarcerated women. And this is what Marissa had to say. Black women and women of color need to be at the heart of this. And that's not to say that there's no leadership for white women, because it's happening to them too. It's just that the disproportionate effect that this has on Black women makes this intense for me. We barely serve Black women in Chicopee, not because they're not arrested, but because they get longer sentences and thus are sent to Framingham. But Black women also take a bigger hit when they leave jail and prison. So there are so many things that happen when you're a person of color and a Black woman and other women of color, that Black women and other women of color need to be at the forefront. We need to be at the table, helping to make decisions and shape the way that these movements operate, right? So we need to use Black feminist theory as a praxis, not just to inform the way that we understand power, not just the ways in which that it can be used to help us dismantle white supremacy, but also we need to incorporate it in our own values in the way that we show up in the world, how we engage with one another, how we partner across race, across communities, across borders, and also the ways in which we center Black women, not just as folks who can go out into the communities and navigate Black and brown spaces, but also in their leadership capacities, the things that they bring to the work as leaders.
So thank you to the organizers and to Crystal for opening this paper. I'm going to speak very briefly about part of the paper, which is that we need to recognize the radical anti-white supremacist roots of human rights work in the US. The struggle for racial justice and for reproductive justice has been long and enduring. And we want to emphasize that this human rights struggle, which critically informs reproductive justice, has been led by Black and brown people throughout US history. It's built in part on an effort to gain international recognition for the human rights harms close to home And in the larger paper, we look at how the idea of US global supremacy and white supremacy are entwined, and how those notions are used to justify the denial of human rights to Black and Brown people domestically. So it's critical to note in the 1940s, even as the United Nations was created, Black human rights defenders were using the UN to petition for an end to segregation. That call, drafted by W.E.B. Du Bois and many others, some not recognized and credited for that work, as well as colleagues, other colleagues at the NAACP, was submitted to the UN in 1947. It was a landmark human rights document. It drew attention not only to civil and political rights violations, but also the denial of economic and social rights to Black people in the United States. The report spoke profoundly to the lack of access to healthcare, housing, education, and food. And so then by the 60s and 70s, we see a new generation, especially those mobilizing through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to get the United States to join another important covenant on ending racial discrimination, calling for a holistic approach to racial justice in the states that would require a fulsome engagement around all things that would support reproductive justice as well. Those folks were red-baited on purpose. They were cast as communist, much as we saw socialism used as a weapon in the recent elections. But we've had a long history of engaging with the idea of human rights as a radical collective idea, not just a tool of liberalism. So I want to just highlight that reproductive justice and human rights are interwoven throughout certain human rights treaties that we don't participate in. It's a part of the legacy of the US exceptionalism, the only country in the world not to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We don't participate in the treaty around women's liberation. And so these core principles listed here are things that we unpack in a more expansive discussion about the intersection between racial justice and reproductive justice.
Thank you so much, Crystal and Kathy. So a reproductive justice praxis helps to shed light on the many ways that social workers can become aware, be accountable, interrupt, and dismantle structures and practices of permissive violence and work toward anti-oppressive and liberatory micro to global approaches. Next slide, please. Social workers can aim to understand the interrelated mechanisms and harm of colonialism and settler colonialism through a local to global lens, not as an event in history, but as an ongoing structure and practice. For example, an ongoing practice of the global north is exploiting the global south of natural resources, which devastates the health and well-being of sustainable communities. For example, in these photos of open pit mining in Valle de Siria in Honduras. The impact of a capitalist practice of resource extraction dislocates communities, creates environmental refugees, and forces migration to the United States. And then immigration and border politics then criminalize bodies, separate families, and deny basic needs that can save lives. Further, the condition of state-sanctioned unjust detainment of bodies normalizes and dehumanizes and creates othering, putting children, trans, and women's bodies at risk for sexual violence, as well as forced sterilization of women in US detention centers. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. Thank you. So centering voice as an instrumental component of what we can focus on in social work is an example with some women who I spoke with about their abortion experiences in Chile in the context of illegality. But what's hard, I think, is that something happens to you that cannot exist. I would say that was the most violent, but it's a hidden violence. It takes out some sort of trusting in society or that I have a place here. So if women and two-spirit and trans abortion experiences do not have a place to exist, then the state can give it the place it wants. And this highlights the critical nature of centering the voices of those who we work with and use this to guide our practice. Next slide, please. So marginality is not only a place of social exclusion, but also a place of resistance, a place of strength, and a place of collective power, creating new paradigms and ways of being and moving in the world. A reproductive justice praxis invites social workers to imagine, in the most radical sense, how to partner in solidarity and resistance with women of color and others across the globe who are continuing to lead efforts toward decolonization and the realization of human rights. Thank you.
And so we just want to say, the struggle continues. We will continue to think about how to use these different critical theories to dismantle white supremacy, and we look forward to your questions during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, colleague, to really enlighten us on many levels as to how we really need to move from the local to the global as we take on this important topic. So I'll see you in the general Q&A.
Thank you.
We're now ready for our second panel of today. And our second panel of today focuses on Black Mothers Matter, reimagining child protection and a state that supports Black mothers. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the three panelists who will join us. They are Natani Eddy, MSW Esquire, Marcia Hopkins, as well as Dominique Michael. So welcome, colleagues, to this important topic. In the interest of time, I'm going to shorten your bios and know that everyone will have an opportunity to read them because I think what's most important is that we give you the time needed for your important presentations. Natani basically is a staunch believer in the uncompromising resilience of families. She's worked in around child welfare and juvenile justice systems for more than 10 years. Marcia Hopkins, also an MSW, believes in the power of youth voice and the inherent strength of families. She earned her master's degree in social work from Temple University. And lastly, so good to see you, Dominique. Dominique Michael is deeply committed to highlighting the historical and present-day lived experiences and acts of resistance of Black families in the United States. Again, I urge you to read their more complete bios, but colleagues, it's yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're really grateful to be here with you today. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, Black Mothers Matter, Reimagining Child Protection in a State that Supports Black Mothers.
Again, I'm Natani Eddy. Today, we're going to begin our presentation with a dedication. Then we'll provide a few grounding questions. Dominique will discuss the history of the child welfare system and its relationship to Black mothers. I will explore the modern day child welfare system, specifically its population and governing federal legislation. And Marcia will share our call to action and how we can reimagine the child welfare system in the future. We'll close out with a few reflection questions. This presentation is dedicated to our mothers and all Black mothers. As a Black female social worker, I acknowledge the pain of Black mothers who have been pulled into the country's complicated child welfare system.
As a Black female social worker, I recognize the isolation and marginalization of Black mothers' desires and needs versus the demands of the system.
As a Black female social worker, I can no longer remain silent as the system continues to disrespect our Black mothers, our Black sisters, and our community.
The questions that were at the base of our deeply personal, political, and scholarly exploration were, what has the relationship been between the state and Black mothers, particularly the child welfare system, and how can this relationship be reimagined to be supportive of Black mothers?
We also want to start us off by reading this quote from Dorothy Roberts that makes us question and sit with how carceral the child welfare system has been and how it has treated Black mothers. One aspect of the carceral state that polices Black mothers that often gets overlooked is the child welfare system. It's amazing that this gets so little attention given that it's such a powerful system. It's a system that allows government agents to force their way into your home without a warrant and take your children away based on unproven allegations, subjective suspicions, and before any adjudication of wrongdoing.
In order to understand and upend the current relationship between the child welfare system and Black motherhood in the United States, we must begin with understanding the historical and contextual dynamics of this relationship, which expands outside of the boundaries of child welfare work into the relationship between the state and Black mothers in general. That history begins with the arrival of Black mothers to the United States via chattel slavery. As Isabel Wilkerson brilliantly notes in her book Caste, the foundation of the social, political, and economic systems in the United States is the racial caste system, which was birthed through chattel slavery, an American innovation and institution. The maternal relationship is one that was undercut by the institution of slavery in particularly cruel manners. Accounts of the state-sanctioned violence against enslaved Black mothers are numerous. However, I believe slave narratives, such as the one highlighted on this slide, allow for the true grasping of that violence. What does it mean for a Black mother to have to reflect to herself, "I can never forget that he was a slave. Sometimes I wished he might die in infancy"? This quote makes clear that during the era of chattel slavery, Black motherhood was made illegitimate by the state in both documentation and practice. Regardless, Black women continued to mother, and Black motherhood was corrupted and forced to reshape to fit these inhumane circumstances. The attack upon Black motherhood did not end with chattel slavery. Rather, it evolved itself to fit the requirements of the new era. While Black women could no longer be held as slaves, Black women continued to be viewed as sources of labor to be exploited and expropriated, a status that was continually reinforced by the state. This view of Black women as exploitable laborer contributed to a disregard for their other roles, including their roles as mothers. Inadequate support for recently freed slaves and pervasive anti-Black hiring discrimination locked Black women into participation in an exploitative labor market in order to ensure the survival of themselves and their children. In addition to permitting the creation of an economic system that systematically exploited Black women, the state used the legal system to reinforce white supremacy in a multitude of other ways. One example is through the creation of public safety net policies, such as the Social Security Act of 1935, which included funding for nationwide aid to dependent children, but discriminated against Black mothers. Up until the 1960s, Black women were excluded from receiving cash benefits. In this way, a policy meant to support mothers was in actuality a policy that further supported white supremacy and devalued Black mothers. After mass protests and mutual aid campaigns from Black mothers, such as the ones featured in my rightmost photos, a member of the Black Panther Party holding her newborn, and a member of the Poor People's Movement protests standing with her 2 young children, Black women were granted access to aid. However, there was nearly immediate Black backlash, with Black women being scapegoated as welfare queens and misusing the system and creating a need for welfare reform. The themes of exclusion, inclusion, and backlash that were prevalent between Black motherhood and the state in general created the foundation for further attacks on Black motherhood through the child welfare system. The foundations of the child welfare system as we currently know it began in the 20th century through private organizations providing support to needy families and children, and almost universally discriminating against Black mothers. Between the 1940s and 1970s, Black children across the nation began being incorporated into the child welfare system as it shifted from private to public provision. However, according to the work of Billingsley and Giovanni, this inclusion was centered around the belief that Black children either had no parents or at best had one inadequate Black mother. The mistreatment of Black mothers by the child welfare system hit a peak in the 1980s. Across the US, the total child welfare population doubled, and the proportion of Black children in the system grew drastically. Simultaneously, policies became more punitive, shifting towards removal and away from providing in-home services to children and their families. This resulted in Black mothers like Jornell being thrust into lifelong battles to stay connected with their children. Through first refusing to assist Black mothers, and then through forcibly removing thousands of Black mothers' children, the child welfare system participated in the furthering of the narrative that Black mothers have no right to their children, a narrative that began with chattel slavery and is now perpetrated under the guise of child protection. I'm now going to hand it over to Natani to speak more about the present day.
Thank you, Dominique. So I'm going to briefly walk us through the child welfare population and just 2 out of several federal laws that have governed the modern day system since the late 1990s. Next slide, please. Keep in mind this powerful quote by Patrice James of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. What the criminal legal system is to Black men, the foster system is to Black women. Next slide, please. As Professor Dorothy Roberts wrote in her article, Race and Class in the Child Welfare System, minority children, and in particular African American children, are more likely to be in foster care placement than receive in-home services, even when they have the same problems and characteristics as white children. I hope this slide is clear for all of you to see. If not, it's from a presentation entitled Race and Poverty Bias in the Child Welfare System by the American Bar Association. And while the chart is from 2014, not much has changed in terms of the ratio of the child welfare population since then. In 2014, Black children represented about 14% of the total children in the national population. Yet they comprised 23% of Child Protective Services reports and represented 22% of the children who formally entered the system through foster care. So what does that mean? The child welfare system had a higher percentage of Black children, by 8% or more, than in the entire national population. You can compare this disproportionality to children of any other race, but I wanted to hone in on white children. They represented about 52% of the total children in the national population in 2014. When it came to CPS reports and formally entering the system through foster care, their percentage was 46%. This means that the child welfare system had a lower percentage of white children by about 6% in its population in comparison to the national population. So why are Black children so highly represented in the system? One reason, to paraphrase Dr. Brandy Nicole Brooks Harris from her book, Black Single Mothers in the Child Welfare System, is that Black single mothers are more likely to have multiple calls to child welfare due to a lack of cultural competence in reporters who may not understand the difference between child-rearing practices and how Black mothers respond to the emotional needs of their children. Which leads to the question, what guides who gets reported to the system? Next, we'll briefly explore 2 federal laws that govern the child welfare system. Next slide, please. Sometimes interventions that are meant to help end up causing unintentional or intentional harm. The emphasis of the question of intentionality is my own view. As Professor Sankaran of University of Michigan's Law School shared in an article recently, federal laws, along with those enacted by states, have created a child welfare system governed by complicated procedures. In my opinion, although child welfare legislation on its face appears neutral, taken as a whole, their effects have had a disparate and disproportionate impact and have caused devastation to Black families. Let's briefly discuss the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, which is also known as ASFA, and the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act of 2016, which is known as CARA. The Adoption and Safe Families Act created the 15 out of 22 month in care rule, which was intended to prevent children from languishing in care. The law came about during a time when the response to drug use was especially punitive to Black people. Its effect serves to reduce the amount of time it takes for agencies and courts to pursue the termination of a parent's rights. The law remains good law even during the pandemic. Unlike mortgages or rental payments, which have been suspended, there has been no suspension of ASFA during this time. The clock continues to tick for the 15 out of 22 month rule. ASFA is especially devastating when you consider the overrepresentation of Black families in the child welfare system. The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act was enacted to help newborns and infants who exhibit substance use-related disorders or withdrawal symptoms. Professionals who work with the mother, including the Child Welfare Agency, which becomes involved after receiving a notification from the hospital that a newborn, infant, and or their mother tested positive for substances, are required to develop plans of safe care to ensure the child's protection and development. But I want to pose to you, who is most likely to be subjected to a drug test at or following the delivery of a newborn? There are numerous reports of the discriminatory handling of maternal health for Black mothers. They are often tested for drug use at a higher rate than white women. If mothers don't comply with the requirements in a plan of safe care developed by professionals, their children are at risk of becoming formally involved with the child welfare system. Next slide, please. So this quote from Dorothy Roberts and Lisa Sangwai represents so much. Removing a child from their family, their home, or their mother is one of the most violent acts a government can undertake against its people. Like the prison and immigration systems, the child welfare system frays family and community bonds and strains the ability of affected families or communities to politically organize and resist attacks on their children and families. All are oppressive systems that work together to regulate, punish, and control the most marginalized people, fueled by a racist ideology. Think critically about the effects of the child welfare system on Black children and their mothers. Question why Black children continue to enter care at such a high rate. Examine the language of the law and consider its real-world effects. Are the policymakers or lawmakers who pass federal legislation Black mothers who've experienced the child welfare system? And one last question I want you to consider is, how do you push or challenge the system to examine itself and its impact on Black families in particular? Now I'll turn it over to Marcia, who will discuss how we can reimagine the child welfare system.
Thank you, Natani. And thank you, Dominique, for such a comprehensive look at the history. I'm really excited to talk about the future. I think it's so important to talk about the history in our current state, but we're really excited about our paper because we believe and see a future that moves us away from our unhealthy relationship and reliance with our current child protective system, and really want to encourage us and move us to move forward to a future that respects, and protects Black motherhood. Next slide, please. So I want to sit briefly here with these two quotes. One, we really are discussing in our presentation abolition and why we're calling for abolition, and what does it mean to really upend the child welfare system at the root. And I want to just take a moment and say the Movement for Family Power's quote, because I think it speaks for itself. An agency that has the power to apprehend children and dissolve families will never play a meaningful role in the service provision in a community. We have a lot of work to do, folks. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? How do we move us towards a future that protects Black motherhood and Black families? And how do we create a culture of family that is not deficit-based, where we actually believe that Black mothers and other families of color are valued? One, we need to take accountability for the harms that we have inflicted on Black and brown families, and we need to do something about it. And we need to recognize that the results of structural and interpersonal racism are not inherent character flaws. They are not personal defects of Black people. Instead, we need to address these factors. There are so many societal challenges that our families face that we actually need to implement real things. We need to make sure that our families have livable wages so that they can take care of themselves and their families. We really need to address and discuss making sure that families have access to affordable quality education and housing. We have a real housing crisis in America. And we need to really talk about the war on drugs and decriminalizing drug-related offenses. We need to talk about mental health crises and who is being incarcerated due to mental health needs. And we need to see these and racism itself as a public health crisis and initiative for Black, Native families, and other families of color. We cannot continue to sit in a space where white families only have access to these supportive systems. Next slide, please. Other calls to action from abolitionists and things that we believe that we need to move forward to is, one, decrease and eliminating the federal open entitlement for funding for foster care. As you heard from Natani earlier, these funding streams are inherently rooted in racism and tied to which families get connected to this system. And we need to fund community-based programs that actually address family and community needs and remove funding away from this racist carceral system. And we need to create new budgets, and we need to defund agencies. And the reality is, y'all, some of us are sitting at these agencies, and we need to talk about what does it mean to remove funding from our organizations that are harming and destroying families, and take those funds and reallocate and redo our budgets and put it into meaningful resources that are actually going to sustain and protect our families. And I want to sit here, and I want to repeat what I said again. We want us to move towards creating a future where we respect and protect Black motherhood. And I want us to call ourselves out and address, why is it that Black mothers and Black children wait for justice? We should not have our Black mothers and our Black children waiting for justice. We need to give them justice now.
And so you just heard our recommendations, our call to action, and you may be reflecting on whether any of this is possible. And this is not a question of possibility. It is a question of commitment. Are we willing to commit to valuing Black mothers?
Are we willing, are we willing to do what is required, which means changing our personal behaviors, our public practices, and our public policies?
Are we willing to hold ourselves and others accountable? You know, I want to take a moment to draw attention to this photograph. We chose this last photograph for a reason, because we think it's so powerful. This woman, this very pregnant woman, is standing here protesting, and her sign says, "We are not caring for 9 months, then struggling during labor for 9 hours, just for you to kneel on their neck for 9 minutes. Mm-hmm. Black Lives Matter." We chose the topic and the name of this presentation that Black Mothers Matter for a reason, because across the long history of the United States, they have not mattered. And we're asking today for social workers, particularly social workers in child welfare, to make a commitment to change that history and that present day. So we really hope that you take our call to action seriously, and we really look forward to having time to answer questions and discuss this more with you all. So thank you all for listening to our presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was trying to think of the right comments, and I just thought I'd just raise my hand and affirm the movement. Thank you so much for reconceptualizing this whole conversation around removing children being violence to the Black mother. I want us to kind of absorb that it is violence. Now, having said that, again, we'll have more questions in the general session, but I do want to pose this one question to you. What are the pitfalls? You told me the reasons we should abolish the child welfare system, but are there any pitfalls that you recognize? Because the National Association of Black Social Workers have really been on this for a long time, but what is there? How do you do what you are proposing to do?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say 2 quick things. I think one, when we say abolition, people think we mean abolition tomorrow. This is not going to happen tomorrow. Abolition is a long-term process. That means that we have to do some real work and do some critical accountability to get where we want to be. And I think, too, we have to acknowledge that we have patched up this system for years, and it's not doing its job. We are in the same place that we have been in years ago with disparities. And so I think we have some real questions for ourselves, right? It's not enough to just change policies. We have not changed our values about how we value Black mothers, how we value Native mothers, how we value immigrant mothers. That inherent value and racism still exists. And so what we're saying is that we've got some real work to, one, create that as a value, that we value Black motherhood, and 2, we got to do some real work instead of slapping on these small policies to actually value, respect, and sustain our Black families.
And I don't want to harp on this too much. And I think one of the big elephants in the room here is, what do we do when children are at risk of serious harm? Right. That is something all of us in this room love children. We got into this work because of a love for children and wanting to force children to thrive. And it's something we struggled and talked with. But when we look at who ends up in our child welfare system, the majority of children are there because of things related to poverty. And we have them because of us not having an adequate safety network in the US. And even the children that end up being at the highest risk of harm, often those things are also connected with these same inadequacies in our public safety net. So we're giving the child welfare system a job it wasn't made for, and then we're surprised when it fails to actually fulfill that mandate. you can't address child safety until you address the child poverty problem in this country.
Okay, thank you so much, colleagues. All I can say is we're in great hands. So I look forward to gathering with you at the end of the third panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So it's now my pleasure to introduce the last panel for this session. And of course, we will have another one, 3-panel session that follows us. The first 2 panels have really made us think about where we're going here. So the last section talks about imagining a new world through Afrofuturism, a response to racism within the social work profession. I am pleased to introduce to you Lakendra Mitchell-Dove. Dr. Dove holds a MSW. She is an assistant professor at Portland State University in the School of Social Work. She has over 15 years of post-MSW practice experience, and she works primarily with families and children. She also has experience in community-based mental health, child welfare, community organizing, and healthcare. She has also worked in the areas of racial equity and social justice. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Lakendra Mitchell-Dove, and she will also kind of share a little bit more about trauma-informed pedagogy. So welcome, Dr. Dove.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I am so excited to be here to speak with you all about Afrofuturism as a potential framework for addressing racism within the social work profession. I stumbled across Afrofuturism primarily as a result of my growing discontent with how racism was being discussed and not really centering the voices and experiences of Black people. And I wanted to really look at a different way that we can potentially talk about moving this work forward and that is more inclusive. Let's see, I am having some technical difficulties here. Just one second. There we go. So we'll start with looking at those who came before us. Throughout this series, we have learned about the amazing leaders in our communities and their incredible contributions. And one common theme to highlight is the fact that much of the work transpired prior to the birth of social work as a profession. So our ancestors have been guiding us to remember, just as they did, the various strategies and approaches that they implemented to imagine, envision, and birth new realities for themselves. We are being called to think beyond what exists right in front of us, to not allow the heaviness of racism, oppression, and discrimination to cloud our ability to use ingenuity to create new paths. I want to honor those who came before us. They may not have considered themselves Afrofuturists, and it was their courage and bravery to hold space for the imagining and envisioning of a new reality that was not rooted in enslavement, racism, oppression, or discrimination that makes them Afrofuturists. The essence of Afrofuturism was present in the everyday lives of those who use their intellect and creativity to envision a better way of life and future for themselves and generations to come. So we'll start with Sojourner Truth, who was an advocate for abolition, civil rights, and women's rights. At the 1851 Women's Rights Convention, she delivered her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" She spoke out for the rights of women and African Americans. Harriet Tubman was a visionary whose determination for freedom and liberation is unmatched. She believed in her right for freedom and manifested it as her reality. Her visions and dreams were the blueprint for liberation for many Black people. Ida B. Wells Barnett, a journalist, activist, and researcher, she was very vocal about lynchings and experiences of Black people in the South. Mary McLeod Bethune, an educator, civil rights and women's rights leader, she was the businesswoman who opened a boarding school, which became a college and is now known as Bethune-Cookman College, which is a HBCU. Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights and voting rights activist, and she's known for the quote, "Nobody's free until everybody's free." For this presentation, I will be referring to Afrofuturism in the context of the contributions of Black women to social change and how we can continue to build on the work and contributions of those who were brave in their thinking and imagining of a world where Black people experience freedom, and what we can learn from their blueprints and the ways in which they were able to forge ahead in spite of the incredible odds and challenges they face. So in essence, Afrofuturism is a concept, a framework that has been with us. Our ancestors used their ingenuity, were very creative in thinking about the future and what they wanted for themselves and their generation to come. They didn't settle for enslavement as their only possibility. And on the minds of Black people was freedom to have control over their bodies, to pick a mate, to parent children, to travel at will, to be educated, and to advance well beyond their present state. So what is Afrofuturism? Afrofuturism is vast and spans the arts, music, literature, science fiction, speculative fiction, and the philosophy of science, just to name a few. There are various definitions, and for the purpose of this presentation, we will define Afrofuturism as a framework to tell Black stories from a Black cultural lens with an emphasis on technology, the future, and liberation. Now, the term Afrofuturism was coined by Mark Dury in 1993 in an essay entitled Black to the Future. He argued that African-American voices have other stories to tell about culture, technology, and things to come. Now, there is some debate about the use of the term Afrofuturism, as Mark Dury is a white man, and as we are working toward reclaiming our stories and telling them from the perspective of Black people, there have been different manifestations and iterations of what Afrofuturism is. So we have other terms such as Black futurism, African futurism, Black quantum futurism, and astral Blackness. So I just want to highlight that Afrofuturism is something that is seen in a variety of genres and is seen throughout the culture of Black people. And when we think about music, we think about artists such as Sun Ra, George Clinton, Erykah Badu, Janelle Monáe, Kendrick Lamar. And when we think about film, I think one of the most prominent films that come to mind for most people is Black Panther, and how it centered the experiences of Black people in a world that colonization or society where colonization did not exist. So Black people have the liberty and freedom to live their life and move at will. So we also see Afrofuturism in literature. Most people don't know that W.E.B. Du Bois was also a science fiction writer. The Comment was written in 1992 from that perspective. So Afrofuturism centers liberation and is future focused. There's also emphasis on curiosity and fantasy, and it is a counter narrative to society's views of Black people as inferior. So Afrofuturism as an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. So why Afrofuturism in social work? So as I stated at the beginning, for me, I was growing increasingly frustrated with the way in which the discourse or conversation in regards to racism and white supremacy was unfolding. We're certainly at a space in society where we are seeing the demand for change in a variety of arenas, and social work is one that we really need to examine. Our profession, we need to work towards centering the experiences of Black people and people of color. We need to move towards understanding that there are various ways of knowing and being, and honoring those ways of knowing and being, that are inherent to different communities and populations and their cultural traditions. So we are really at a space where, as a profession, we can begin to look at who is it that we want to be. There's often a disconnect between who we say we are as a profession and what we value or our principles. There's a lot of emphasis on social justice, but do we truly see that enacted throughout all areas of social work as a profession? And we also need to be mindful that there is no one size fits all. And we need to be open to exploring multiple frameworks and perspectives for addressing white supremacy and racism. And for me, Afrofuturism is a way to center the experiences of Black people, to bring in the voices of Black scholars, to bring in creativity and imagination. So again, just to emphasize the important contributions that Black women have made and continue to make, we have definitely been at the forefront when it comes to change. And we see that from our former leaders and our ancestors. We see that now, and certainly we will continue to see that to come. So Afrofuturism as a movement itself may be the first in which Black women creators are credited for the power of their imaginations and are equally represented as the face of the future and the shapers of the future. Now, I just want to highlight Octavia E. Butler as one of the pioneers of Black science fiction. She's also recognized as the mother of Afrofuturism. But it's also important to note how her writings illustrate her commitment to centering the experiences of Black women, particularly from a futuristic perspective. When Black people were largely missing from this style of writing, she challenged narratives that erased the existence of Black people and offered an alternative regarding Black people's place and existence in the future. So she really examined in her writings and her novels Black women and their relationship to power in society, how society viewed Black women, and how Black women could be in a space where they could imagine and envision power from a different perspective. Her writings also interconnect the past and the future from an Afrocentric perspective. Time is not linear, time is cyclical. So we are certainly being influenced by the past, currently, and the present. And what we're doing now will certainly influence the future to come. And one of her most famous quotes is, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you." So it's really important that we are looking at Afrofuturism as a framework for creating a vision for ourselves in terms of moving forward as a profession. And I almost forgot to mention one of the things about Octavia Butler. She was very clear about indicating her wishes or desires for her novels. And she did, one of her wishes were granted in terms of Parable of the Sawyer. She wrote that in 1993, and it actually hit the New York Times bestseller list in 2020. And if you are familiar with Octavia's work, you kind of know that this was a goal for herself. So this is something that was accomplished 14 years after her death. And if you haven't had an opportunity to read Parable of the Sawyer, I would highly encourage you to do so. Some would say that she was very prophetic in terms of what she could foresee and in the future, and some of what she writes about in that particular novel is eerily similar to some of the challenges that we are experiencing today. So when we think about how do we move forward as a social work profession, I really want to highlight the fact that it's not either or, it's both and. And when I say what I mean is that my experience and what I largely see is that when we talk about racism and white supremacy, there's also the discussion in regards to anti-oppressive practice and social justice, which these discussions are needed and these frameworks are needed, but they largely center whiteness. And oftentimes, Black people and people of color are extremely tired of talking about racism and white supremacy from the perspective that does not center our experiences, rather talk about the adverse effects and the historical trauma. So there's a need for us to really explore multiple ways in which how we discuss white supremacy and racism. And Adrienne Marine Brown's work talks about this as a potential framework, emergent strategy. She also notes we have to create futures where everyone does not have to be the same kind of person. So when we think about Afrofuturism and how it can be helpful for a framework for social work practice, we can look at it from the perspective of pro-liberation and transformative justice. And I would imagine that ultimately our end goal, whether we're talking about racism from a perspective of anti-racism or pro-liberation, should be healing and moving forward in creating a society where we are having different experiences versus centering one particular perspective over another. And as Black people, we definitely want to be in a space where we are moving away from striving to thriving. And we really want to be able to have and engage in conversations where we are not only centering our trauma and our oppression, but we are also centering our strengths, our ability to forge forward and to create a better path for ourselves. So what are the implications for social work practice? We definitely could use Afrofuturism as a framework and looking at social work education. So how do we begin restructuring what social work will be in the future? How do we begin to embed in our curriculum various scholars and perspectives that center the voices of Black people and people of color? When we look at social work practice, how to use the core elements of Afrofuturism to center creativity, imagination, and liberation. How do we move from a deficit-based or problem-based perspective in terms of how we work with individuals towards healing and start to honor some of the traditional practices in certain communities that are used. In terms of social work practice, how do we think about the shift in demographics as we move towards a society that will be majority people of color? So this again will be inviting communities that are traditionally not represented in social work research to really to have an understanding of their experiences and also not necessarily continue to value the gold standard and really amplify the voices of Black people and people of color. So my thoughts in regards to the future of social work, we have to examine our core values, service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. Right now in my program, we are beginning to have conversations about restructuring our curriculum, where we want to move forward with embedding more material that speaks to healing and liberation and transformative justice. And we recognize that this is not going to be something that's going to transpire overnight, and it's going to take the commitment of all involved within our particular program to really shift the narrative. But there's also understanding that we can't just center anti-racism. We can't just center anti-oppressive practice or say that we value social justice and we're not looking at multiple ways to have that conversation. We need a paradigm shift. We need to be able to have spaces where Black people can show up and be seen. Black people and people of color can express their joy. They can express their intellect, their creativity. They can express their Black girl magic in a way that is not threatening. We have to be willing to imagine beyond what exists. And ultimately, we want to see Black people as liberated and sovereign beings. And I'll close on this final note. This is a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown. She states that reclaiming the right to dream the future, strengthening the muscle to imagine together as Black people is a revolutionary decolonizing activity. So I thank you. I think I'm at my time. And thank you all for being with me here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dub. You really just know the second panel, I gave them the Black Power sign. Your panel, I think I have to give you some of that kind of love as we think about it. Certainly that first panel, I would have given them the high five. So we began to think about Afrofuturism. But you talked about some of the sheroes. And one of them, you kind of talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. And one of the things that Fannie Lou Hamer said is, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Mm-hmm. And so your whole presentation sort of wraps me around that thinking. But in the 70s, the Howard University School of Social Work came out with something called the Black Perspective. And one of the things that comes to mind when you're thinking about introducing this new paradigm is the struggle to moving to what you call not either or, but both and, because you are really proposing this, but not just for African Americans or Black people. So how do you make it a both and when the sensitivities are not across the board?
I think that there's space to have those conversations, not necessarily that they have to be in silo or isolated. I think the whole notion of not either or, both and, is that there is a need to talk about anti-racism for those who don't have much experience or don't really have an understanding of what that means, but also for those of us who that is our lived experience, and we want to move forward and having more of a conversation about how do we center our joy and our liberation. Those conversations are necessary too. So I think that we need to create space where we can have those conversations, and that everyone is feeling equally represented in regards to how do we collaboratively come together to move the work forward.
Thank you so much. And again, I want you to continue to give thought to people don't concede power easily. And so as you come up with this wonderful way of sort of thinking about this, how do we get people to concede the power that they've always held? And social work practice is a way for us to begin that conversation.
Absolutely.
But thank you so much. And again, for elevating Octavia Butler, because for some of in the audience, this is the first time you've heard of her. So thank you for your contribution to that. So we will now segue into our general questions for the three panels. Welcome back, everyone. We're so glad to have you. And I think if I were to think about an overarching theme of what I've heard is that we need to decolonize what we're doing. Not only we need to decolonize it from our citations to decolonizing it from the way we practice in child welfare, and then even adding a new paradigm to that decolonization. So we're now ready to hear the questions from our audience. Okay, so the first question I have, it states, as a white female social worker, how can I be mindful and intentional of lifting and supporting Black women's voices, leadership, especially our colleagues, while avoiding the risk of being tokenizing? Great question. Mm-hmm. So I will certainly, let me start with panel one. So let me hear your thoughts about this.
So yes, that is a really wonderful question. And I get that question from my students a lot, actually. Like, so what can I do? I'm a white person. I don't want to take up space in, radical organizing spaces that are beautifully led by BIPOC people. And my advice to them is, one, don't reinvent the wheel. If you have an idea about something, ask questions, because it's very likely that somebody else in the community has already come up with it, right? And so what you want to do is you want to go to the community and you want to partner with them, right? In real authentic ways by asking questions. What do you need? How can I be supportive? What are these issues? You want to be somebody that is there to learn, that is there to partner in ways that recognizes the issues with power and identity and privilege. You want to be very transparent about that. And I would go back to, once again, don't reinvent the wheel. Communities already know what the problems are. Folks have been doing this work for like generations, right? So in my work, what really is the barrier are resources. So if you are somebody with some resources and you go to that community and you say, hey, I have some resources that I think that you all could benefit from. How can I share them with you? So
thank you so much, Crystal. And what I'd like to do is also hear from some other people. What do you think about this?
So one of the pieces that I always try to impart to people is listen, actively listen to the voices that are being uplifted, to the voices that aren't being uplifted. I think it is one thing for us to impose what we believe should happen. But as Crystal shared, we really do need to ask questions. But before you start asking the questions, listen to what people are asking for. I think that is something that we miss a lot. I think we miss it in conversations because we're already thinking of solutions without just saying, pause, something's happening. How can I help? Start just by basically listening would be one thing I would offer. Something
simple. Does someone else want to weigh in? Because we have several other questions coming. Okay, next question, please. So as we're waiting for the next question, it is, okay, let me move forward with it. So, this is from critical race scholars in social work. Is there any advice for current social work interns who want to be abolitionists but feel powerless in CPS, meaning Child Protective Service? So I'm just going to make that something about the acronym. So colleagues, weigh in on this. Lead panel 2 talked a lot about child welfare system.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I'll just briefly say, and I give this advice to a lot of people, I think we have to acknowledge the reality when we're working in these spaces. And I think that, we get discouraged, but the reality is that CPS is not designed to do the inherent work that we want it to do. It is inherently designed to remove children. And so I would take one step for interns to recognize where you're interning at, because I think, not saying that it will help you when you start to feel helpless, but I think it will acknowledge for you that it's not something about you that's not working well with your work, but that unfortunately you're at an institution is not designed to do some of the things that you want. I think you can push for what you can and move them in that direction, but we got to be real about the places that we work at and their decision to strategically not do the things that we want them to do. I think we got to know what we're up against and who we're working against. And sometimes that's our own organizations.
Okay, thank you. And I would add that we always have power. There are differential levels of power. Yep. Mm-hmm. And so we have to use the power that we have. But anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I agree with that. I think that interns often we feel powerless, but we have to realize, we're as free labor in a lot of these places, they're relying on us to show up each week. And that means that you have a voice in a system and perhaps more of an influence than some of the clients you may be working with. So that's your opportunity, I think, to recenter whose voices should be heard. So, asking your clients what they want, what they need, and then actually bringing it up to your supervisor instead of saying, oh, I'm not going to get it, so I'm not going to ask. Because I think that's something we do too often. Instead of really pushing on issues, we say we're not going to win. But you can't unroot something if you don't actually start doing the work. So we have to believe it's possible, I think.
Yes. Can I add one other quick thing? I want to say, because that was a question about an intern, right? And I really think that responsibility and obligation should really fall on the shoulders of our schools of social work and our departments of social work, right? And so I think we have to get a little bit more strategic and really clear about how we place our students in those environments in the first place, right? And not put those kinds of obligations and responsibilities on a student who's an intern there, right? Their job is to learn and to get their degree. And we want to support them in challenging those systems. But if we're going to be frank here, they are not going to be positioned well to do that, right? And so if I'm a dean or a director of a program of a school for social work or department of social work, I would be thinking really carefully with the field department about our relationship with those institutions and those systems. And I will be having conversations with our students about what it means for us as social workers when we say that we have a social justice mandate not to reproduce violence, that we're sending you basically into the lion's den. And so here are some tools, here's some information. We need to think about how we're mentoring and supporting those students in those environments. But I think we also have an obligation to think about what does that partnership look like? What can we ask from those agencies and institutions on behalf of our commitment, right, to be abolitionists? And so I don't want students to feel that burden falls on their shoulders.
Thank you. But I do want students to believe that the responsibility is their shared responsibility.
Sure.
Because we want every student to believe you have the power
Sure.
to implement change. And sometimes it starts just with asking the question.
Sure.
Why do we do this?
Sure.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Okay, the next question. What would it look like to give resources to families and not use the child welfare system as a gatekeeper? Please jump in, anyone.
I think I'd be happy to lead off with saying that really this is about social and economic human rights. And we have a right to an adequate standard of living. We have a right to fair wages. We have a right to social security. We have a right to healthcare, adequate food, and housing. And we know that there's great disproportionality in the payments that are given to foster families to support a child that might have been placed to them compared to cash assistance that families who are caring for their children on temporary assistance to needy families may gain. So we need a radical restructuring of how we prioritize reproductive justice, women, the process of mothering, and of really valuing the dignity of children. And this is profoundly so within the African American community, but it's a responsibility of the entire society to look hard at these systems we've created.
I would also add that it's important to recognize the resources that are inherently already exist in the communities and how those resources can be utilized to support children versus utilizing the system as a way to gatekeep.
Okay, thank you all so much for your responses. And the last question is a two-part question, so we're going to start with the first part of that question. So the first part of it is, how can social workers who work in or out of the CPS navigate policies within colleges of social work and enforce mandatory reporting when your values and knowledge know that this promotes systemic racism? I think the abbreviated statement is, when you know better, how do we deal with being told not to do the right thing? So that's a shortcut to that question. But it's an important question. Yes.
I was just going to add to, what Dean Sandra, is alluding to and saying, I think too, and I think what all of our presentations are calling to is, we haven't really done the work. So for those of us who have worked at CPS, may currently work at CPS, the practice of CPS has not changed. It's been the same. And personally, and professionally, I have not really heard nobody working within CPS challenging the morality of mandated reporting and talking about who's getting reported and talking about the policing and surveillance of families. That process and that practice has not changed. Every year people say we need some cultural competency, but cultural competency has been whitewashed down. And I think that we need to be real. And I think that you, like Dean Sandra is saying, like, if you know better, do better and call it out and say what needs to change or what needs to stop. because you can't feel guilty about it and feel like such and such, but you haven't gone to say anything or do anything about it. I think we have some real work that folks can do internally at their organizations. You have to call it out.
And I think even within agencies, there is just bureaucracy. We know that that's the reality of the situation. But so much people can really do. We can push back as often as we want. But to the point of our presentation too, we have things that are mandated that are above, those who are even within the agency and the organization. So how do we challenge and push back there as well?
I think too, just one thing I want to add is if I'm thinking about myself or students I work with, I think the advice maybe I would give to this point because is acknowledging how imperfect this structure that we've created, but also to say that you may make this call, but that doesn't have to be the end of what you do.
Yes.
And I think that if we really think about of mutual aid and the things that have come like from Black feminists and other scholars of like, how do you, if you are telling this young person, this is what I have to do, but I'm not going to leave this now on you to deal with or on a parent. I'm not going to leave this. I'm not going to leave you alone to navigate what I know is this horrific system by yourself. And I think at minimum, we can make that commitment and do that work. And talk to families realistically about what's going to happen next and how we can be there to help and support them.
Thank you. I want to just also add one final thing. I think also going back to what I stated earlier is thinking also about how do we support BIPOC students who are in those agencies, right? Because, challenging those systems and those institutions, I go back to when I was an MSW student and I remember confronting my agency that I worked with in community-based mental health. They wanted to expel a first grader out of school, like completely expel her out of the system. And the backlash that I experienced when I challenged them in doing that was severe and terrifying. And it was only because I had the backing of my school and my liaison that I survived that experience. But this particular individual wanted to completely destroy me because I was calling out something that I identified as violence against kids of color.
Okay, part 2 of that question that's coming up. And so as I sort of bring this to the close, I would remind you, even though there are flaws within those systems, there have always been champions within those systems to make change. So I think it's really important that we never lose sight that you stand on the shoulders of people who shook the boat. And so they are there. So even though it's we see the problems with the systems, but there were some people who's got rid of some of those problems. Does it still need to be changed? I say yes. But I remember my founding dean and reading her writing where she challenged segregation in field placements. And that was in the 40s. So we've always had people on the inside of systems making trouble. As John Lewis would say, making good trouble. So as we close this session out, I want to certainly thank you all. You have really given power to the people as we've had this conversation. You made us think deeply about this. But the work that we have left to do is how do we get the both and together? Because there's resistance, not only within the profession, on the outside of the profession. So that is the work. And as I said at the beginning, we're in good hands. I thank all of you for joining us for this panel. Thank you so much for the privilege.
Thank you.
I think we're now ready for the break. So we will then be joined by the last panel of the day shortly.
Okay. Welcome back. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had a nice break. I am James Herbert Williams. I seem to be getting some feedback, so I'm not sure. Okay. All right. So again, welcome back. I'm James Herbert Williams. Let me check technology-wise. Okay. All right. I hope you had a nice break. I'm looking forward to the, I am still getting feedback, and as okay. Let me go to, okay. Okay, problem is solved. It has to do with my my limited capacities for technology. So let me start from the beginning, and thank you for your patience with me. So welcome back from your break. I was just impressed with the three previous panels this morning. And as I would say, I think they set the table for some additional wonderful conversations this afternoon. So let's get right into the presentation. So if we can bring up the first group of presenters. Okay, all right. All right, my, welcome, a very illustrious group. So we have, I have 8 people on my screen. So, and so in sake of time, I'm going to introduce you all, and then I'll just probably introduce you and your affiliation, and won't go into details around your research background, just sort of leave more time for your presentation. So the first on my list is Dr. Meredith Francis, who is a transdisciplinary postdoc scholar at Washington University in St. Louis, with also a joint appointment at the Brown School, as well as the WashU Department of Psychiatry. And then we have Alexis Jamel. I hope I said that correctly. Yeah, okay. Alexis is an educator, activist, researcher, and critical social worker with expertise in racial justice, healing, and liberation. And then Dr. Laura Voigt. And Laura is an assistant professor of social work and a center affiliate of the Center of Trauma and Adversity at the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. Then Tyrone Hamler. Tyrone is a practitioner and also a doctoral student, and does work in Cleveland at University Hospital Medical Centers and at the Metro Health, looking at things of health inequalities and disparities. And then Amy Korsh Williams is a senior instructor at the Mandel School at Case Western Reserve, and also a faculty affiliate of the Center on Trauma and Adversity. And then there's a person that's not on my list that's on my screen, and that's Hung Jung Lee. Is that correct? Hopefully, again, I apologize. And I think when you speak, you'll have to, because you're not in my list of people. So when you speak, welcome, and you'll have a chance. They're going to be presenting on a paper that's entitled Radically Imagining Anti-Racist Social Work Research Using a Trauma-Informed Social Justice Framework. The floor is yours, my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And before we get started, actually, if I could have the slide closed, please. Before we begin, I want to say that this work is a work of a collective. And so we decided to invite the entire collective here. And we're going to very, very quickly introduce ourselves a little further by sharing our affiliations as well as our position within the university. So my name is Meredith Francis. As you said, as you heard, I am a postdoctoral scholar at the Brown School in St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Alexis Jamal, and I'm an assistant professor at Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College in New York.
Laura Voith, an assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University, Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences.
Anna Ortega Williams, and I'm an assistant professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, also in New York.
Amy Korsh Williams, senior instructor at the Mandel School at Case Western Reserve University.
And
Move forward, I guess.
Lopez.
Okay.
And I'm Hyunjin Lee. I'm a doctoral student studying social work at Case Western Reserve University.
And I am Tyrone Hamler. I'm a doctoral candidate, and I am studying social work at Case Western Reserve University as well.
So, you came to this space today expecting a traditional academic lecture, but since September, our group and our process have transformed. So instead, we are going to invite you into our space of community, scholarship, and imagination by telling some stories. Our first story today is the dominant narrative of social work research that we learned. And this story says, knowledge is our currency and power, and we must present ourselves as the ultimate experts in our fields. This story says, our work is a commodity defined by products and must be quick, high volume, easy to interpret, and marketable to be valued. This story says we must cut off all of our identities that don't fit into the narrow box of what an acceptable social work researcher looks like. When asked, what do? We are supposed to condense and silo our entire selves into a 2-minute soundbite of an elevator speech. This story says we must forge our own individual paths in competition with each other for jobs, tenure, grants, publications, and awards. This story says that we are commodified individuals. If this commodification, individualism, and conformity sounds familiar, it is because these are the values of white supremacy. These are the structures that have allowed past researchers to violate the human rights of Black, Indigenous, people of color. The push for rapid results and high productivity can lead to relying on practices such as norming white middle-class populations, such as extracting knowledge from communities affected by systemic violence to conduct research without mutuality and collaboration, and by publishing findings in high-impact but inaccessible research journals. When our research process is steeped in racism from the conceptualization of the work to the enactment of the research project, we can only produce outcomes that are racist and reinforce white supremacist narratives, practices, policies, and culture. May I have the first slide, please? The nature of oppression is to divide and conquer. In Latin, the prefix dis means to be separated, and white supremacy and racism asked us to dismember our whole selves and be controlled and confined. When we brought our full selves into the research space, we were told to not be too political, but our very existence in this space is political. So we chose to push back. You see, we came to social work research because we value social justice, connection, and humanness. Like the young girl in Faith Ringgold's tapestry, we are embedded in the tapestry of our communities, but seeking to soar with them in our imaginations, always connected, always part of a larger story. In Latin, the prefix re means back to the original again, and the process of coming back to our original selves as social work researchers became a process of remembering and joining all of our pieces together again. Close slide, please. We struggled against the dominant narrative to find ways to remember and honor our whole selves and communities. We argue that this process is essential for research that challenges white supremacy and oppression. We present to you today 2 frameworks for working through this process. The first that I will present now is a trauma-informed, socially just research framework developed by a subset of our group. This framework draws on trauma-informed principles, intersectionality, and healing-centered engagement to shape the entire research process from conceptualization to dissemination for researchers and participants alike. In this framework, we translate these clinical principles for the research setting and propose guidance in each stage of research for the researcher to consider, including first the proximity to and power over marginalized communities, second, an ethical responsibility to prioritize a social justice orientation, and third, a duty to be mindful of trauma and adversity experienced by all people involved in the research. Our focus today is on the second tool, but we will drop a link to the full work into the chat as soon as we are able to. The second tool for this work is radical imagination, and I will let Alexis share the story of how we came to it.
For my contribution to our presentation, I'd like to offer us, this collective, as a case study to provide the counter narrative and to explore the question, what does it take to dismantle dehumanizing systems, programs, practices, and reimagine and implement the alternative? By telling our story about how we came to be, what we've done, and where we go from here, I hope to share 2 main ideas. One is that radical imagination is both process and outcome, in that connection with action sparks radical imagination, igniting new possibilities, especially for how we coexist and co-create. And the second idea is that to do trauma-informed social just research, basically that's humanizing research to do research that humanizes, you have to become a trauma-informed social justice researcher. So how did we get here? We, being assistant professors, independent researchers, doc students, doc candidates, and postdocs located in New York, Ohio, St. Louis. In addition to being diverse with positions in academia, we are diverse ethnically, racially, by gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. Here, meaning presenting together at this symposium. Well, we started out as separate groups, mainly Silberman and Case Western, that mostly met at the SWIR conference in January 2019. Anna and I attended the session on trauma-informed socially justice research, the framework. Because we ourselves were collaborating and engaged in a participatory research project to develop a scale that measures healing in terms of getting to the core of the harm and reclaiming possibilities. Through the efforts of 2 or so individuals on each group's behalf, a connection was created, the initial spark. And the first Zoom meeting was scheduled for Thursday, July 9th, 2020. We all showed up to that first Zoom meeting, not really sure about what was happening or going to happen, but we made time. We showed up. We faced the unknown with a spirit of curiosity, and we embraced the idea that things don't have to be the way they are. Perhaps these are components of radical imagination. So then what? May I have slide 2, please? The ways in which we resisted, pushing away, pulling from, twisting around the dominant narrative, co-shaped the shapeless Zoom space we created for ourselves. We started with relationship building by sharing our passions, which is a quick way to reveal the authentic self. Since white supremacy is dehumanizing, as a survival tactic, we have learned to hide our authentic selves for protection. So existing in one's truth is an act of resistance. We invited creative methods into the space, and engaged in some socio-dramatic activities. For example, on Zoom, we did a whiteboard exercise answering the question, what will it look like when we win? I invite your responses to this question in the chat. What will it look like when we win? Artistic modalities can inspire creativity and spontaneity, two potential ingredients that spark radical imagination and tap into the unknown. We also looked to radical queer Black feminist knowledge and to our elders for guidance. We listened to and discussed the dialogue between Angela Davis and Grace Lee Boggs. We learned and allowed that dialogue to challenge us, to dig into philosophical activism, or to be activist philosophers. We began thinking about growing our souls in community and wondered aloud if social work is soul growing work, so that it's soul show work or soul shall work. We thought about ways to become the people we need to be to do our work, whether research, practice, or education, in a humanizing way, and considered if we are the ones we've been waiting for. We identified methods and ways that valued lived experience, starting with how we can value our own lived experience. With this work we were doing together, I found that we made the head, heart, hands connection. We connected our heads, vision, philosophy with our hearts and our feelings, and then connected it to our hands, our action, to have a more integrated and holistic experience, which is radical and against the tenets of white supremacy, of being disconnected, not present, and certainly not being your full human self. White supremacy is inhumane, and thus, when human beings are being human, we are dismantling white supremacy. So where are we headed from here? We've decided to let our imaginations create the space. That seems to mean that we cultivate radical imagination and support each other's efforts in transforming imagination into action, which we coin Imagine Action. We continue to do more of the same, building trust and community in ways that support our humanity. We work together to get to the core of dehumanization and contend with the harmful impact through ways of healing, finding our humanity in this process and using this process to support our humanity. We reclaim the infinite possibilities that things don't have to be this one way or as they have been. This is the way things are is not a justification for maintaining the status quo. For example, for me personally, this radically imaginative space that we've co-created supported the design of an elective course in critical radical social work that uses applied theater, which is theater for social justice, created by, for, and with community as a method of education and action research. This course has radical content that challenges the micro-macro divide, and it uses a collaborative co-facilitation model, which does not happen in my school. My co-facilitators identify as white and trans and Latinx and queer. When have social work students ever been educated using applied theater with a co-facilitation model with 3 people with these intersecting identities? This course was born from radical imagination and is the manifestation of radical imagination. Grace Lee Boggs stated that a crisis, like a global pandemic or an attempted coup, is both a threat or a danger to social justice values and an opportunity to be the people we need to be to do radical imaginative work. Close slide 2, please. So I'll end my part with this idea. We can use radical imagination to change how we do our research and how we educate and how we practice. But first, as is evidenced in this case study, it seems that we first need to use radical imagination to transform ourselves. To close our presentation, I pass it to Laura and Anna.
Thank you. May I have the third slide, please? We, all of us, listening and participating in this presentation, are grappling with contradictions. We work in the very institutions that uphold white supremacy and racism in our profession. To paraphrase James Baldwin, all of society is balanced on the precipice of agreement that is unwittingly taken from each of us. We as a collective have recognized that by deeply engaging in ordinary moments that could be transactional in nature and shifting them into something that is transformative, we can each individually dismantle these harmful structures we've consented to as scholars to rebuild and shape the alternatives. It is possible. Close slide, please. We find ourselves in a crisis as a society, as a profession, and in our own professional scholarship. How do we dismantle racism and white supremacy, these seemingly omnipresent cultural beliefs from the very institutions that we engage with every day, that shape who we are, how we interact, and how we spend our time? This is no small task and can seem intimidating and even impossible if we approach it from the lens of a crisis. However, if we consider this crisis to also be an opportunity, then we can find a way to be comfortable in this liminal space, a space in between, where we are both resisting and striving. In this space, we can pull back the curtain to see our research and scholarship for what it truly is and what it could be. In this vein, we must both call out the flaws and brokenness of our system and also imagine and act out the solutions. To borrow a term from our foremothers, Grace Lee Boggs and Angela Davis, we need to be activist philosophers, or maybe even social work philosophers, if we want to change the world that we are living in. Using the trauma-informed, socially just research framework and the process of radical imagination, the folks presenting alongside me today created a space where we ask each other deep questions and reflect on how we can engage in our roles and spheres of influence in a way that embraces the humanity of all those involved. We've invited you into this space with the hope that it stirs something in you to enact trauma-informed socially just research and radical imagination in your own space and in your own way. In doing this for ourselves, we have co-created a space that is not only free, but one of active consent, a space where all of the questions of what is were not predetermined, leaving space and freedom for us to answer these questions together and to organically question, answer, and act out what could be.
We invite you to consider several questions. First, we ask you to take a moment and think about the question, what informs how you show up? This could be as concrete as asking yourself how you showed up to this presentation, or as broadly as how you show up to your scholarship. What is the point? In order to become something different, we get to be there and come with a sense of curiosity and willingness. Showing up to a space to be and to become is transformative because it can help us reimagine the way things currently are into the way things could be. The next question, how do you as a scholar want to feel when in community? That is, how do you want to feel when connecting with others to do this work with other researchers, developing scholars, community members, agency staff, and everyone connected to your scholarship? The dominant narrative in research says we must extract, reduce, be objective. It tells us that our whole authentic human selves are not fully welcome in this work. That instead, we must only bring a part of ourselves to what we do. That we may be how we code switch to focus on scholarship or research methods that we use just to get by. Whether that is finishing our dissertations, getting grant funding, getting a job, getting published, to be in community in ways that are encouraging, affirming, and embraces the light within each person, we all need to create space for contemplation and consideration. As Grace Lee Boggs proposed, perhaps most simply, we need to be in community with others to grow our souls. The last question we have for you to think about, and you're welcome to put this into the chat. What could you do to nurture your work if you did not have to contend with the violence of racism? In our space, we are nurturing a community of imagination and resistance, and that in and of itself offers us more breath to envision what is possible. The future of anti-racist social work and research that is trauma-informed and serves social justice is evolving. Through our desires, experiences perpetuating the opposite, and creating space to develop questions to get free.
And so, lastly, as a collective, we want to thank you all for sharing space and engaging with us today. And we're hopeful that you leave our presentation with renewed energy, purpose, and focus, ever moving from surviving to thriving. And we would like to leave you with a single word that captures the gist of our experiences together so far.
And I'll start us off. My word is growing and transforming. I took 2.
My word is words soul growing.
My word is connection.
Healing.
Acceptance.
Empowered.
And my word is disruption.
Thank you all again. And we are closing our presentation.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to use a couple of words: very inspirational, very thoughtful, very intentional. I'm going to take a lot of words. Sorry, I know you said one, but if it's okay. I know that I do have one question, because we're going to bring you back. So I want to thank you for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And it shows that when people come together with a common sense and a common set of ideas of what they want to get done, the power of that sort of connection that takes place. My one question I have, and of course, I know you're going to say, oh, here he goes. So, but you're all at very elite white institutions. So that as far as this field of social work, I'd love to hear your thoughts briefly, and we'll bring this back at the end, of how do we address the macro issues that's related to these types of situations that really sort of challenge this type of work that you want to do.
It's hard with a collective. Who wants to respond? Such a good question. I'm gonna pass. I'm gonna at least go second, if not later. I think Alexis is feeling it.
Yeah. I think collaborations are key because they collective power, and you do the work anyway. You face the challenges and you do the work anyway. So.
Actually, Laura, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in line. So actually, this has inspired me to pursue some of the things that I wouldn't necessarily have pursued as a postdoc, because I have a very time-limited chunk of time here in St. Louis, and normally I wouldn't have expanded my bubble. But I actually started reaching out to community organizations and working with them. So for example, when the cold snap hit, we had pop-up shelters happening all over the place in the city. And I was working with a collective to make sure that everybody stayed safe during the extreme cold. And that would not have happened if I had stayed in my bubble. So again, this is that piece of take what's here and take it into the community. Mm-hmm. Give yourself that permission.
Okay, thank you. Laura, I'm sorry, I'm being very informal here, Laura, and then we'll have to go on to the next panel. But you had said you wanted.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Thank you for the great question, and I assure you that those who haven't spoken yet probably have really important insights still to share. So please come to the Q&A, everyone. I think I think it's just that, the fact that we created this space in these very, very predominantly white, I mean, essentially racist institutions, and we came together and found each other in collaboration. And I guess I'll just draw upon two things that I think really illuminate that in our talk, which is being able to stay in the struggle, right? We talked about that as staying in the liminal space, being able to stay in the struggle in a way that both pushes against, but also strives for. And I think that sort of shift in orientation in one's being will allow us to be able to make meaningful impact in the structures and institutions in which we are embedded.
Right. Well, thank you. The work that you're doing, one of the downsides of where I'm at now is I can't be seeing the chat. And I'm sure that this is the type of thing that is very much connecting with a lot of scholars across the country. I also applaud you to use sort of a trauma sort of informed approach of looking at this work, because we know in the work that we're doing in our profession, you can always probably start at trauma, because trauma is so predominant among most of the populations that our profession works with, as well as the people in our profession. So we know it's both ways. I look forward to a wonderful, robust, and round of conversation. Q&A at the end. So thank you again, colleagues, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. What a invigorating conversation and a thoughtful presentation by our colleagues across the country. So now we'll move into our second presentation and panel of this last of the afternoon. And that one is Envisioning Anti-Racist Social Work Organizational Change, Amplifying the Gray Literature. And that will be Colleen Martinez and Gina William. Am I correct? Gina, did I say your name correctly?
You did. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let me give you a little brief introduction, if you allow me. So Colleen Martinez, Dr. Martinez is a licensed clinical social work, registered play therapist supervisor, and assistant professor of social work at Ramapo College of New Jersey. And Gina William, well, it should be Williams, like my name, but they don't have the S there. Sorry. Gina Williams is has 23 years experience in child welfare and is an adjunct professor at Montclair State and also Ramapo College. So we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours, Mike.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams, and thank you to all of the organizers and presenters involved with this symposium. We've really been learning so much from you, and we're honored to be in your presence. I'm Colleen Martinez. I'm a white woman who's privileged in a number of ways, including being an assistant professor at a state college and being a consultant to agencies and schools. When I began teaching critical race theory at a predominantly white institution, I realized that I wanted to impact my sphere of influence about anti-racism in more informed and more effective ways. As a consultant, I wanted to learn how child and family serving organizations and institutions can engage in anti-racist change.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gina Williams, and I immigrated to the United States from Egypt when I was 5 years old. As an immigrant woman of color who grew up in an almost exclusively white community, dynamics of race and ethnicity were always something I contended with. As a social worker and educator, racial justice has been a moral calling. But the sense of urgency to undo racism became even more critical for me when I gave birth to a Black son 15 years ago. While I've been active in anti-racist community organizing, trying to adapt those efforts to organizations proved especially challenging. There are so many ways to approach this work, and I wasn't quite sure where to begin. So I sought out this research project to find a starting point.
We want to begin by expressing our appreciation to and recognizing those who have been doing the work that we'll be discussing with you today. Not only those named who wrote the documents that we'll share, but also the many individuals who contributed to wisdom and knowledge that we continue to learn from. We would particularly like to acknowledge People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, whose Undoing Racism workshops we collectively have been fortunate enough to participate in multiple times since 2014. In August of 2020, we began to explore the scholarly literature on racial justice and anti-racist organizational change in social work. We came across a significant amount of work on anti-racist change in schools, political and social action, anti-racism and social work education, and anti-racist work in countries outside of North America. Specifically in the social work literature, we found many publications on cultural competence, cultural humility, equity, diversity, and inclusion. However, we found few peer-reviewed articles in the past 10 years on anti-racist organizational change in social work. One point that we did come across consistently is that when we're talking about making change in organizations, we need to use the terms race and racism. A number of raters point out that the phrase equity, diversity, and inclusion is insufficient because it doesn't focus on shifting power. Having previously seen toolkits on anti-racist organizational change on the internet, we looked to the literature to understand how the academy views such documents. Fortunately, we found many scholars suggesting that gray literature, as opposed to white or academic or white literature, is a legitimate and an important source of knowledge. And a number have called for the increased use of gray literature to inform social work specifically. Gray literature definitions vary, but the term generally can be applied to works that are not subject to the peer review process and are produced outside the commercial publication industry. Gray literature can include reports and working papers that are produced by non-academic practitioners, government and nonprofit organizations, institutes, and think tanks. Being outside of the constraints of the academy, gray literature may be more likely to reflect the voices of women and people of color. Gray literature enables us to learn from the leaders in the work and their lived experience and wisdom, which may not always make it into academic sources. Additionally, gray literature is typically more up-to-date and more freely accessible to practitioners than academic sources. However, there are challenges. When we committed to reviewing gray literature for this project, we turned to the internet to find source documents. One thing that we learned is that materials on the internet are literally ever-changing. Web links and websites sometimes changed from week to week. New materials constantly became available. One new website might lead us down a path of 100 links to explore. To be able to conduct our analysis on time for today's discussion, we closed our search on December 31st. We were looking for documents that provided detailed steps of anti-racist organizational change in North America. Our review resulted in a final sample of 9 documents, which are pictured here. None of the individuals, consulting groups, nonprofit organizations, and foundations that produced these documents overtly identified themselves as social workers or social work organizations, but we think it's likely that some of those involved may have been social workers, and we're confident that their work is directly relevant to social workers. These documents were shared as monographs, toolkits, and workbooks meant to document anti-racist organizational change processes and to help others in their efforts to do the same. We recognize that there may be other documents that we didn't find in our search. If you are aware of any other sources that we might include in our paper, we would be very grateful to hear from you. We independently coded and then together conducted a qualitative comparative analysis, analyzing similarities and differences, identifying codes and themes across the documents. What we will share going forward are the themes that we identified. We hope that these themes can help to begin to answer the question, what do social work organizations need to do to become anti-racist? One of the first themes that many of the documents address is change on multiple levels. On the personal level, the documents indicated that anyone engaging in anti-racist work needs to exhibit humility and critical self-reflection. Remaining in a learner stance and accepting the challenge that as a white person, I need to continually work to earn my credibility as an ally, and that I'll never fully arrive at being anti-racist, that's a part of the work. I particularly appreciated being reminded that I should engage in anti-racist work, but not in the woke Olympics. A reminder that my efforts should be humble and non-performative. Gina will discuss the interpersonal and institutional levels later in our presentation. The societal level is beyond the scope of our discussion of organizational change, but that provides a scaffolding for societal level change. While much of the work of anti-racist organizational change is not linear, one of the foundational steps indicated in the documents was examining and building organizational readiness and commitment. In order to ensure resources and authority are provided to make change possible, strategies to build the will need to be developed. Some documents discussed racially insensitive incidents in the organization, new leadership that was committed to anti-racist work, or surprising findings of workplace surveys that spurred the process. Each organization will have its own reason for considering the process, but several documents reminded us that if organizational will and commitment to invest in anti-racist change isn't there, the work will be unsuccessful. Some things to consider include who will be supportive of the work, who will oppose the work, either passively or actively, deciding strategically to what degree senior leadership will be involved. How do you talk about racism with your trustees? How do you address past harms? This requires having healthy and candid conversations. No one person can make an organization change, and all the documents discuss the need to think and act collectively and collaboratively. Not surprisingly, we were reminded that communication is an important topic in this work. From recognizing and valuing diverse communication styles, to guidelines on authentic and respectful dialogue, to planfully managing how information is shared, communications are a priority. Some documents referred to information sharing with the wider community, including open meetings, free discussions, e-newsletters, and using social media, local groups, and posters as a means of communication about the work that you're doing. As you'll find throughout our presentation and many of the topics we'll share, there are no hard and fast rules about the best way to address communications, but it is an important topic for your consideration. Universal across the documents was the message that gaining knowledge must play a part in the process. They discussed the need for learning, listening, education, awareness, training, and agreeing on a shared vocabulary and understanding of concepts, including race as a social construct, racialization, Eurocentrism and white supremacy culture, privilege, and intersectionality. Here we're reminded that we need to remain in a humble, non-defensive learner stance. This is an ongoing journey of learning and will never fully arrive, but hopefully we will continue to progress. Also relevant here, many of the documents remind us of the concept of multiple ways of knowing. While some of us may automatically default to valuing scientific ways of knowing, we're encouraged to recognize and value all ways of knowing, which can include sensory, aesthetic, and personal lived experience. Finally, several documents mention the use of consultants as a strategy to build knowledge in individuals and across organizations. Some of the documents we reviewed were published by individuals and organizations that offer this type of consultation. Other organizations discussed how they hired consultants during their process of change. The documents suggest that assessment is an important phase in the process of anti-racist organizational change. In line with the use of consultants for educational purposes, some of the documents suggest the use of a consultant to conduct the assessment, specifically to ensure anonymity. Ensuring that those who are sharing their observations and experiences are protected from repercussions is something that we're reminded of here. Regardless of whether the assessment is conducted internally or with the use of an outside consultant, our review suggests that collecting data, specifically disaggregated data, is a necessary step. Remember that this data or evidence should also include lived experience and wisdom of those who have been impacted by racism within the organization. In this assessment, we want to get an accurate view of individuals' beliefs, actions, and experiences, as well as the culture of the organization. What are our policies? What are our practices? What's it like to work here, interact here, to be a Black, Indigenous, or other person of color in this organization? After gathering this information, many of the documents suggest ways to analyze it. Two that we'd like to highlight are asset mapping and determining organizational place on a continuum. Asset mapping, which is reminiscent of eco-mapping, is a visual exercise where we identify and organize information about assets. When we identify resources, supports, and opportunities, we can use a strengths perspective to help us in what will undoubtedly be challenging work. Last, many of the documents suggest that we will want to determine our organization's current place on a continuum. The model or continuum ideas varied across documents. Some shared stages, levels, or cycles of race equity. This continuum is an exemplar, but the basic premise is that when we find our organization's current location, we can begin to determine what our goals are. We're likely all familiar with the concept of SMART goals. All of the documents mention the importance of goal setting and prioritizing in the process of anti-racist organizational change. What are some goals when we undertake this work? The W.K. Kellogg Foundation states that for them, the purpose of this work is to challenge and dismantle racism, support racial healing, identify and address historic oppression and privilege, remove present-day barriers to equal opportunity, and interrupt the racialization process in which people and institutions operate. While the documents suggest that we do want to set visionary goals, we should also be realistic. Community-wise resource centers suggest that we consider what can we actually do at this moment in time with the resources we currently have in order to set reasonable and relevant goals for ourselves. Goals and priorities will be different for each organization, and the priorities should be determined by the team doing the work. Building upon the familiar foundation of SMART goals, SMARTY goals suggest that all organizational goals should be inclusive and equitable. Imagine how our micro and macro practice would shift if there was an organization-wide commitment to inclusion and equity in all of our planning. I'm now going to turn it over to Gina. I think my colleague is having some difficulty. Can you folks still hear me? Oh my goodness. I apologize. I wonder if we can pause and then come back when my colleague can make it back in.
You bring me back to the stage? Oh, okay. I'm not exactly sure what happened. She lost her internet, I guess.
I'm not sure. She's going to work on getting right back, I'm sure.
Okay. I think if you're comfortable with it, we may move on to the, well, I don't know if they're ready. Yes. If they're ready, and then we can come back to her for the last segment before we move on to the overall Q&A. Is that okay?
Okay, so it looks like in the chat that they may not be ready, so I'm going to open up some additional notes so that I can okay. I apologize. I am going to be a minute.
You know, this is our world these days. Don't worry about it. Let's just continue to move forward. Wonderful presentation so far.
Thank you, and hopefully my colleague will be able to make it back in.
Okay, I'm gonna get off stage now and then let you talk about some other things if you have some other notes.
Okay, I'm going to pull up my notes in a second. I apologize. So I don't know if you're still seeing if you folks are still seeing my notes, and I apologize. I'm trying to find Gina's notes and I just don't have them in front of me. I apologize, folks. I wonder if somebody can jump in and forward my slides if I can find my notes from Gina.
Colleen, I'm sorry, did I lose you before?
Yes, Gina, are you back?
I'm back, and I did a really great job presenting this slide, but apparently nobody saw it. Can we start over with this particular slide?
So give me 1 second, and I am going to see if I can.
I'm so sorry. I had no idea that I had lost you guys.
My goodness. This is quite a, okay, so you can still see my slides. Okay, here you go, folks. There's Gina.
I apologize.
No worries.
So, one of the main points shared by all the documents is the importance of interpersonal dynamics in the anti-racist journey. All personnel at the organization must be involved with this work in some way, although only some will take on leadership roles. Despite the varying degrees of involvement, the organization must embed this work into all aspects of its functioning and communicate that all staff are expected to integrate anti-racism into their roles. What some documents refer to as the change team is the committed select group that leads the organization's change effort by establishing and working within an anti-racist framework. An important approach to including all staff in anti-racist change is to provide them with opportunities for caucusing, which allow them to self-select a group based on their shared identity. This allows similar members to gather and learn from one another. Racial caucusing reduces the burden on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to educate others about their lived experiences, and it gives members of the dominant group an opportunity for self-reflection and education. Many of the documents we reviewed highlight building trust as a foundational step for the interpersonal level of change. Trust building requires openness, vulnerability, and a commitment to learning through relationships with people from different backgrounds. An important recommendation made throughout the documents is to center the voices and experiences of people who've been most impacted by racism and to provide them with opportunities to lead these efforts. However, this needs to be balanced with a thoughtful approach to avoid tokenizing, exploiting, or overburdening these individuals and their physical and emotional labor. The Kellogg Foundation calls for a compassionate environment that allows all staff to express their humanity. As the previous slide indicated, some staff will be resistant to this work, and even among staff who are supportive of the change effort, not everyone will be anti-racist all the time. Conflict, tension, and resistance are expected components of this work and may actually increase as a result. The act of discussing racism will reproduce racism, which is a common presence in our society. The ongoing testing of one another during this change process can lead to the deepening or the unwinding of trust. Space must be created to address individual experiences of privilege and pain. This can be done through love for one another, resilience, humility, and humor, and by recognizing that there is no way to create safe spaces, just safer spaces. When conflict surfaces, it is important to slow down the process and listen. Conflict can be transformed to generate relationships that develop clarity, respect, and deepen the group's commitment to anti-racism. It can increase accountability and create more wisdom, and it can help prepare the group for how to handle the next conflict. A shift in leadership and power dynamics needs to occur during the change process. The documents implore current leaders to make an explicit commitment to anti-racist organizational change and sustain these efforts by embedding them into the day-to-day and long-term operations. Current leaders are called on to recognize the importance of shared leadership and shifting power to groups who've been most impacted by racism. The Annie E. Casey Foundation advises us to seek underrepresented voices and not only include them at an existing table, but allow their input to reshape, expand, and transform the table. We're reminded that power must be explored, understood, and named, and how it advantages some groups and disadvantages others. We must also examine our conscious and unconscious beliefs about who is skilled or competent enough to lead. Courageous leaders yield power and foster humility by examining how power preserves the status quo and then using it to push for change. Undoubtedly, this shift in power dynamics will be challenging, as privileged people may resist an analysis that questions the sources and outcomes of their power and moderates their privilege. Some of the documents maintain that all aspects of human resources must be delivered through an anti-racist lens. From recruitment to retention to leadership development, racial justice must be at the forefront in order to establish a truly equitable workforce that recognizes various experiences and skills at all levels of the organization. This may include changing what is valued in terms of professional experience, degrees, and credentials to include lived experience and proven skills, so that all qualified candidates are given access to joining the workforce, regardless of earlier limitations on opportunity. We are advised to establish race equity benchmarks for recruitment, hiring, and advancement opportunities. Performance evaluations should include anti-racism as a core competency for all staff.
Gina, I just wanted to let you know that they're telling us to wrap it up a little bit quickly. Okay. More quickly.
So we're going to move on to accountability and making sure that accountability is incorporated into all levels and all units and functions across the organization and all of its programs. We also have to be reminded to build in anti-racism as part of the norm in the organization's culture. We're reminded that organizational culture is often influenced by white supremacy culture, which can create barriers to change. Some staff assimilate and adapt to this, but others may feel unwelcome and undervalued. Organizations must reprogram their employees' mindsets and behaviors to create a culture that is accountable to all and promotes equity for people who've experienced oppression. Accountability is ultimately about aligning the organization's actions with the commitment it has made to racial justice. This is done through transparency, participation, and responsiveness at the personal, interpersonal, and organizational levels. And then we can just move on to the discussion summary. So many of the tools we reviewed shared common wisdom about undertaking this work. An important reminder is to stay the course. Whatever course that is will be based on each organization's priorities. There's no single path to complete this work, and each organization has to build their own capacity to advance racial justice. This process is not universal, predictable, or linear. It can be messy and will require flexibility. This is long-term work and can be a slow process. Expect barriers and bridges and learn from mistakes. One of the documents likened this work to jazz music, and the process can start, stall, stop, and restart again. Organizations must be ready to regroup, rethink, and restart. This work can be risky, but it's worth the risk, and it has to be approached from the heart, mind, and will. This process requires a deep investment organizationally and individually, and it's a lifelong process that only deepens and must be promoted as the organization's norm. We can move on. So it's clear that this work can be daunting. One of the things that struck me in many of the documents we reviewed is that while this work is challenging, it can also be soul-enriching and fulfilling. Engaging in anti-racist organizational change is both an intellectual and emotional process that can bring joy and love to one's life. We were reminded again and again that this work does not only benefit Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, but everyone benefits when there's justice and equity where we live and work. These are the references for and the links to the 9 documents we included in our analysis. We hope that you'll explore and share them widely with others who are interested in this work. Many of the documents include assessment tools, inventories, activities, videos, and other practical resources. So we want to thank you very much for your work and for your interest in our research. Please feel free to contact us, and we look forward to hearing your questions.
All right, Dr. Martinez, Dr. Williams, thank you very, very much. Our apologies for the little glitch along the way, but great information. I tell you what, I'm going to hold my question, and we will have you back after the next presentation, and we will have some questions at that point. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
All right, our last presentation of the day is social work movements using movement lawyering as a frame of action. And that is being presented by Dr. Sophie Sarantakis. I hope I'm saying that name. Sophie, did I say that name? Please pronounce it.
Sarantakis, okay. Yeah.
And Dr. Shannon Sleever. Hi, Shannon, good to see you. Dr. Sophie is a licensed clinical social worker and researcher whose work aims to facilitate the reduction of size, scope, and power in the prison industrial complex. And Shannon's research and work studies restorative and collaborative approaches to justice. Welcome. We look forward to your presentation, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Real quick, I wanted to just do a shout out and thank Drs. Abrams, Crew, Detlef, and Williams for creating this incredible space for all of us to learn and think creatively. Also, quickly before we dive in, I want to just acknowledge the land that Shannon and I are doing this presentation from. I acknowledge and honor the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the original people of the land upon which the University of Denver stands. I also want to explicitly name the Sand Creek Massacre of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes that occurred on this land, the white supremacist violence through which our institution came to be. And because of the complexity of land acknowledgements and acknowledging the theft and violence is not enough, I've started a practice of offering ways for us to take action and support the work of Native writers, organizers, and organizations. And so I don't know if we can put this in the chat or not, but I'll just name it indigenousmutualaid.org, all one word. This is a mutual aid support network, which is organizing efforts in response to COVID-19, and it's a great resource hub where we can donate and support these efforts. And then I also just want to shout out Kelly Hayes, the Native writer and organizer, and her Patreon. If you can look at her work, and if it moves you as much as it moves me, I invite you to become a Patreon and support her work. Okay, so the paper we'll be presenting on today, that's a work in progress on social work for social movements, using movement lawyering as a frame for action. So the driving inquiry, the kind of question that we thought of about that's driving this paper is, how can movement lawyering model be used to frame approaches for how social workers and social work organizations and institutions might deprofessionalize and leverage their positions and resources to amplify the work of large-scale social movements? And this includes, there's a lot embedded in this that we're trying to work out, but this also includes how social work education can be altered to more readily prepare students to support movements, but not only in moments of social upheaval, but in preparation for them, right? So building and striking when the iron is cold, not just when it's hot, as well as thinking through how practitioners, organizations, and we can leverage all of the resources that we have at hand to really propel these movements and advance their goals. And this question was sparked during my time in Chicago, just being in community spaces with movement lawyers and also paying very close attention to the Chicago reparations ordinance, which we'll be using as a case study for this work. There were so many incredible presentations earlier in this symposium about the history of mainstream professionalized social work, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do want to ground us again in a kind of a shared understanding of how professionalized social work came to be and also how it largely still functions today, right? So Janet Finn in her book, Just Practice, as well as many other scholars of social work history have talked about the profession of social work, how it was in many ways sparked to manage the wreckage of racial capitalism. So, you know, from charity organizational societies to casework, our mainstream professionalized social work was predominantly white women providing charity to those deemed worthy, and those deemed worthy were mainly white European immigrants, right? So Black, Brown, Indigenous communities were systematically abandoned by the profession and created their own deeply critical, radical social change movements to fight for and uplift their communities. And those movements far surpassed mainstream social work. And so the goal of mainstream social work has never been to uproot our problematic foundations and build anew, but rather to stay in alignment with the status quo and promulgate the profession to increase the profession's power and legitimacy. So here you see this, you know, this photo of Jane Addams working with children, and also, you know, What is Social Casework by Mary Richmond, and this quote by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, which she did not say about our profession of social work. She said it about the New Deal, but I'm attaching this quote to our mainstream professionalized work as capitalism saving capitalism from capitalism, because social work inherently started as a capitalistic endeavor, in that it has been and in many ways still is fundamentally more concerned with its survival than liberation and true social transformation. So if we move to kind of present day social work, right, there's discourses and views are changing, and this symposium is actually proof of that, right? The different kinds of conversations and ways we're trying to engage right now. There are loud calls for the field to reckon with its violent history and present and really kind of carve new ways forward. There are recognitions that social change work has extended far beyond the boundaries of the profession, and that the most transformative work has been done really outside of the profession, right? So many presentations have named the Black Panther Party, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Lucy Parsons, and so many others. And so we're acknowledging that local organizers and activists outside of the mainstream profession are moving the needle in real time and naming the root causes and working to eliminate them. So this is really important. This work is really important, changing the curricula and naming all these things, but it's not enough. And so I put this, you know, Robin Kelly quote here, who's a historian that I really, really respect. And it's playing off of Arundhati Roy's quote about the pandemic being a portal. He just reminds us that I totally agree that this pandemic is a portal, and as a portal, it is just an opening. And as an opening, nothing's guaranteed. The question is, what are we going to do in this portal? And so I put this here about social work in the present because there's wonderful conversations and shifts happening, but these shifts are still superficial, and we need to do things that actually change material conditions. And so I put that up here as a reminder of we can't just see the cracks and do superficial adjustments. So to think about how we might change material conditions and do this, we've chosen to juxtapose movement lawyering and social work to help us build an actionable framework. And so to ground us in a definition of movement lawyering is the mobilization of law through deliberately planned and interconnected advocacy strategies inside and outside of formal lawmaking spaces by lawyers who are accountable to politically marginalized constituencies to build the power of those constituencies to produce and sustain democratic social change goals that they define. And so I know this is a big definition, and I wish we had way more time to spend and unpack this, but really movement lawyering is organizing work. It's lawyers understanding that their site of struggle is not solely the courtroom and that there's limitations to the courtroom and that they need to take the fight outside into all these other spaces and to band together in solidarity with communities and mobilized folks to achieve really, really big political wins that really change the terrain. And so there's two key features that Cummings, this really important piece, talks about in terms of movement lawyering. And the first is a representation of mobilized clients. And Cummings talks about this as in a way that lawyers connect with what he calls organized groups that have the capacity to disrupt and thereby influence politics. And he kind of talks about how the ideology of the movement lawyer is shifted from a traditional attorney, right? So engaging in this work is a reflection of the lawyer's commitment to a holistic strategy to influence policy and social outcomes while building movement power. Again, it's organizing. It's understanding that it's not just taking individual cases in a courtroom and doing that work. While that work is important, it can be, can include some harm reduction work in those spaces, right? It's bigger than this. And I just want to also kind of, and Shannon will get deeper into this, but talk about the language here. There's a little bit of a language shift, right, about mobilized clients. So if you think about the way that our profession talks about what we do, right, it's to enhance human well-being and help meet the basic needs of people, particular attention to the needs and empowerment of those that are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty, right? And that's pulled straight from our preamble from Code of Ethics. So there's a shift here in the way that folks are thinking of these folks are mobilized already, right? So that's feature one. Feature two, he says, is the use of integrated advocacy. And these two pieces Shannon is going to get into in a deeper way. But he says the essential thrust of this next feature of integrated advocacy is to break down divisions associated with legal liberalism between lawyers and non-lawyers, litigation and other forms of advocacy, and courts and other spaces of lawmaking and norm generation toward the end of producing more democratic and sustainable social change. And I take this piece to mean a flattening of the hierarchy, right? So it's not about lawyers, parachuting into spaces and behaving as though they're the experts in the room. Rather, it's about banding together and attacking an issue through really cultivated solidarity, and also attacking things at multiple levels at the same time. And also embedded in this feature too is the idea that the sites of struggle are everywhere. They go far beyond the courtroom, not just in the spaces where lawyers are typically found. So it's about banding together with mobilized folks and taking the fight wherever it needs to go to achieve big political and cultural wins. So I want to use the Chicago reparations ordinance as a case study. And there was a wonderful presentation yesterday that touched on this that was really powerful. And so just to kind of orient the audience to those who might be a little bit unfamiliar with this case, and I can't get into too much depth with it, unfortunately, but I do hope that you will explore it some more. But John Burge was a detective with the Chicago Police Department. And during his reign, his midnight crew, he and his midnight crew tortured over 100 Black men who were caged in Cook County from 1972 to 1991. And I won't explicitly name the horrific ways that these Black men were tortured. I do encourage folks again to look more into this case. The Invisible Institute just launched the Chicago Police Torture Archive, and you can learn more at chicagopolicetorturearchive.com, one word. So about this case, right, there were a few legal wins over the years as the stories of survivors entered the public consciousness, and they were eventually believed. But after Burge's, I think it was 2008 conviction, Chicago activists really turned their attention toward winning reparations for the survivors. And let me be clear, this is the survivors leading this, right? Also banding together with outside activists as well as their families. And they asked bigger, bolder questions, right? Like, is it enough that John Burge is caged for 4 years? Is that really reparations? How does the harm extend far beyond the individual men tortured, right? What does justice look like, not only for these men, but for their families, their communities, intergenerationally, right? It's deeper than just what happened to these men. And how do we change the terrain, not just to compensate the men for their suffering, but how do we change the terrain for the long haul? So that there's a public awakening about this and an involvement in a way that we prevent these kinds of horrors from happening in the future, right? And so movement lawyers, as I mentioned earlier, they extended the site of struggle far beyond the courtroom. The goal was changing the terrain, not just achieving these legal wins for survivors. And as the presentation yesterday mentioned, in 2015, a sweeping ordinance was enacted that gave Chicago the distinction of being the first municipality in the nation to provide reparations for police violence. But what I want to highlight here is what they asked for. What they asked for is what the survivors thought about when they thought what they really wanted, right? Not just a formal apology, which was included in the ordinance, but a history curriculum on the Burge torture cases to be taught to all Chicago public school students in between 8th and 10th grade. A permanent public memorial so that there's a site where folks can visit from here on out to understand what this state violence, to understand what happened to these men and have it be an act of remembrance, right? Provision of counseling services, free tuition at Chicago City colleges for Burge torture survivors, their families, members, also including their grandchildren, right? Job placement for torture survivors, priority access to City of Chicago's reentry support services, including job training and the like. And then also the creation of a reparations fund in which the survivors, I believe up until this point, 57 men were given these funds, right? And so it was more than just a civil lawsuit and receiving monetary reward for this, right? And saying, okay, well, we'll pay these folks for the pain and suffering they endured. No, it needs to go deeper than that. It needs to involve the Chicago community. And when Joey Mogul, who's one of the lead lawyers, spoke at an event that I was at, they said the prosecution of John Burge was not meeting the material needs of the survivors, right? And so the lawyers and the survivors needed to look beyond the discrete cases and move beyond the legal punishment system as a lever for accountability. So I'll pass it over to my colleague Shannon, who will cover these pieces more in depth.
Yeah, thanks. So, this exploration of movement lawyering is to an end, which is that we are hopeful that it can be used as a launching point for really imagining how social work might actualize our stated values of nourishing social movements and doing liberation work. Social work as a profession has historically viewed our clients as marginalized and as needing our help and charity. And this has been, we've critiqued this a lot. Many of us are now usually recognizing that this view is limiting and even paternalistic. But we would argue that social work as a profession continues to view clients as primarily marginalized. So in other words, as people who are without power, people that we need to empower or grant power to through our services or actions. In contrast, what's striking about movement lawyering is that it recognizes clients as having power and as being already mobilized. And our clients also have power and are already mobilized. there's a rich history, as you know, Sophia has already talked about, of organizing social action, mutual aid in communities of color, queer communities, economically oppressed communities. And we're really failing them in our treatment of them primarily as people in need of services rather than as co-strugglers in the work of liberation. You know, we're not suggesting that social work clients don't need help, services, and support, just that we have failed to recognize the extent to which our client populations are members of a movement, that they're already mobilized and that they're a part of movements in their communities that we can support. And this raises a number of issues which we really don't have time to unpack today, like the need to interrogate white saviorism and saviorism generally in social work, and question the extent to which our desire to retain power as professionals disenfranchises the populations that we seek to serve. Increasingly, our movements for ecological justice are adopting the language and the mindset of degrowth rather than a growth mindset, and we would propose something similar for social work as we begin to view ourselves as supporting from the bottom up rather than the top down. Learning from movement lawyering, we can also see that part of the reason that we continue to see clients as marginalized instead of mobilized is that we continue to see them as individuals rather than as members of a movement. And so historically, we viewed clients as an individual in need of help or service. And yes, we do use this person-environment perspective, and we distinguish ourselves from purely clinical helping professions by acknowledging the role of relationship, environment, context in people's needs and their well-being. But movement lawyering does something pretty magical here. It expands the focus from a client's individual interest to the public interest. Instead of seeking just personal remedies, it seeks social remedies by identifying the social needs and the social obligations that arise from injustice. And you can see that really clearly in the Chicago reparations case. So while we're familiar with the analysis that the personal is political, movement lawyering actually gives us a vision of what that can really look like. And then finally, we think that movement lawyering has some learnings to offer us about the way that we work across lines and boundaries. So social work has historically delivered often siloed responses to social problems, developing specializations in poverty, child welfare, delinquency, and so on. And more recently, we've moved toward more interdisciplinary responses that recognize the interconnectedness of various dimensions of health and well-being and the need for holistic responses that coordinate across the dimensions. But movement lawyering really goes beyond the interdisciplinary, using interconnected advocacy strategies. This was part of the definition, inside and outside of formal lawmaking spaces. So what if social work truly viewed its terrain as both inside and outside of the traditional spaces in which we worked, and interconnected our advocacy with global movements, intergenerational movements, environmental movements, and more? I think we want to try, can we squeeze in the practical implications, Sophia? I know we're coming close on time.
Yes, I think so. Let's go ahead and just kind of try to run through this. Awesome. You did an amazing job there. So what would a social work for social movements look like, right? This is hopefully work that we can all social workers can collectively build on together. But some things we want to highlight, right, is that it's broken up, thinking about it in terms of ideology, mental shifts that need to take place, and then a praxis, right? And the first is that we need to expand the sites of where we co-struggle, right? So liberation and true social transformation is not going to come from our agencies, nonprofits, institutions, right? The text, "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded," can really help us guide this understanding. These spaces are concerned with their survival. So we have to get to know and build relationships with local organizers and plug into movements and kind of get in where we fit in, right? And the second is moving away from the ally industrial complex. We're still on this first bullet here because I want to highlight the word co-struggle as opposed to ally, and working in solidarity with our neighbors and communities. So, not a feeling of expertise or othering, right? These are the problems of those folks, not my problems, but a feeling of inextricable connection and solidarity, right? And Doctors Maxine Davis and LaShonda Fields, I want to shout out their brilliant piece, "Are You a Social Worker Guilty of Performative Allyship for Black Lives Matter?" Right? So this idea of the ally industrial complex. Next part of shifting our thinking is thinking individually and collectively about what we can offer to communities and movements, right? What resources, whether it be space, students, our own personal skills, and thinking about these things and being prepared to offer them. In terms of the praxis, right? leveraging personal, institutional, and organizational resources. And this is for higher ed institutions, agencies, organizations, it doesn't matter. But perhaps you're allowing organizers to use your space to meet. Space is a pricey commodity. It's tough to come by for most organizers. And so a space to meet. Maybe you're providing food for these organizers. You're allowing them to use your printers, your computers, to make zines, to make flyers, other reading material, right? And also, as we talk about, I want to kind of harken back to that initial point of how we're expanding our history to think about these folks who are outside of professionalized mainstream social work and kind of applauding them and praising them. But how often do we put our students in organizations where there isn't a licensed social worker, right? In actual grassroots organizing efforts to actually learn and participate and help amplify those movements. That's something we should be doing. That's a resource that we should be offering up. The second, right, is that in order to do some of the things I just mentioned, we're going to have to fight institutional barriers that impede actions of solidarity, right? And so I'm sure we can all imagine our workplaces fighting against sharing space and equipment with people outside of our organization, right? So we're going to have to really confront these policies and band together to get rid of them. And then lastly, right, I think it's also on a kind of taking it to a micro level, breaking rules that perpetuate harm and working to change them. And I think there was a conversation around mandatory reporting in previous presentations, but we have to teach our students how to be subversive and say no to things and band together in their organizations and say, this policy is problematic. It further criminalizes, it does such and such, and fight it, right? Just because things are policy doesn't mean we follow them. And we should be really working hard to break those rules. And this Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote can just guide us in this, right? The purpose of our work is to gain liberation, not to guarantee the organization's longevity. So all of that to say, I'm just going to end with this beautiful end of a Gwendolyn Brooks poem by called Paul Robeson, where she says, "We are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond." And I think this is the frame through which social work should really start to think through the future of social change work.
Coming back. Yes, there I am. So thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation and very thoughtful. And I have a lot of things come up into my mind as I heard you present that also connects with the other two presentations as part of this panel. So I want to bring everybody back. We're going to have a full screen. There we are. All right, and there may be some other people joining us. Some more of your of the first panel. No, yeah, it's just okay. All right. So again, thank each and every one of you for your thoughtful presentation, but also for the work that you put in to prepare for this. We've all done this, and we know that it takes a fair number of hours to get prepared for this type of work. I'm sure the audience really appreciate it. So we're going to probably have a couple of, there's the first question that's come up here, and it says, as social workers plus community organizers, what skill can we utilize to break us out of the ideology of pragmatism while getting the work done? And this is the Zoom world, so I'm going to say whoever want to speak, just speak, because it just becomes too difficult to sort of identify. So please speak up, and if you end up talking over each other, then you can do your own self assessment. Okay. And I think would you want to start with the people from the first panel, any of the panels? Now, don't have me do the professor thing and call on me. So, please. I'll piggyback on this question, though, because specifically one of the things I think that was pretty clear, sort of among all three of your presentations, were the idea of community and the importance of community. Some people talk about community organizing, all those sort of things. The challenge, though, as many of you know, because all you've trained in social work, that is usually not the strength of our schools in training people to do this type of work. So I'd love to hear your thoughts of what can we do better and how can we do it better?
I mean, I can just jump in and say, to start, I think one of the first things that comes to mind for me is the Mariam Kaba quote that hope is a discipline. And so you have to practice that. You have to really practice and engage in that. And one of the ways that I've done that is personally is being in community and being in those spaces. And I think something that social work, and this is to go back to what my colleague Shannon mentioned, is that social work in the last year has really latched on to this growth mindset of like, what are the new sectors that we can be leading in and all of these things. And I think that one of the big questions we need to ask is, or things we need to do rather, not just ask it, is we need to step back and go listen to folks and say, how can we help? What resources, what skills, what can we just offer this already mobilized community to just help and amplify and lift y'all up? Because it's not about us thinking of new growth sectors and how do we lead, how do we take a big step back and just listen? And I think that actually to me is one of the best ways to kill pragmatism and incrementalism, is to actually listen and watch the folks who are already doing that work.
Yeah,
Dr. Lee, did you want to say something? Please speak up.
Yeah, so my thought was that, we are all bound to certain kinds of responsibilities on our end, like publications or maybe teaching, or maybe outside of, academia and our work boundaries. Maybe we have responsibilities to families, and we are all bound to this ideology of pragmatism. But at the same time, we want to make the, some work getting done in terms of empowering the communities and the vulnerable and the marginalized. And we need to build the connections between those two areas, right? And in order to do that, I think it's important for us to start the dialogue and discussion within our institutions to acknowledge our work related to empowering the vulnerable and the marginalized that are not traditionally considered as something that's very pragmatic, to be really pragmatic and important for our career and our work. So, for example, like the work we do with the communities, that may not be traditionally considered as an important addition to our CV as a scholar, as a researcher. But we would have to start conversations on, do we really want to provide a higher value to publications compared to the conversation we have with the community and the marginalized in the neighborhoods? How can we change this? I think that's the kind of conversation that we should start within our institutions, like the universities, colleges, and our community organizations, so that the larger systems can acknowledge those unpragmatic work as something really valuable and that is really worth looking into when they're looking into people to hire, when they're looking into people to communicate with. So yeah, that's my idea.
Yeah, thank you. The next question, and this is actually to our last panelist. Should we abandon professional social work if our professionalization continues to get in the way of transformation and liberation? But actually, that could be open to anyone, but they asked it to the last time. I love this question.
Yeah, I appreciate this question. I don't think it might seem provocative, but I think this is the question we need to be asking, right? It's, and Chris Melia's really great piece that came out in the fall about the end of social work. I think that's right. I think that's what we need to be pushing for, is this idea of, we already engage. I mean, there's been wonderful presentations about the ways that social workers are an arm of the state, the carceral mindset within our profession. But also, there's just also so many other problematic pieces, right? The licensure, the cost of licensure, who's able to get licensure, all of these pieces. And it allows us to think that we are exceptional in some way. And I think that's part of what Shannon and I are trying to get at in our paper, is that this idea of exceptionalism as though we have some sort of very, very special skill to offer and we should be leading in some way, is that we should just be workers. We're workers. We're social change workers. And we should just be banding together in our communities and not elevating ourselves thinking that we're offering something that is so particularly unique, because as our history has shown, folks outside of our mainstream professionalized field actually did the work better. So
may I jump in too? I just want to say, I think also is which social work do we want to die? Because I think if you look at the work of Iris Carlton-Linné, there have been multiple streams of social work throughout time. So I think drawing from the Black tradition of social work, there's been mutual aid. There's been a process of centering the community. So I think it's a particular type of social work that we want to let go of and that we want to reimagine. And I think being able to draw from the types of social work that's been created across different racial groups, different ethnic groups, and globally, I think that we could learn by decentering white social work.
Mm-hmm. And Mer, were you getting ready to say?
Oh, yes, I was actually going to just one thought on that in favor of thinking deeply about professionalism is who are we excluding when we have those barriers? I mean, licensure tests are so expensive, and the process of licensure just is exclusive. So, we really need to think that way as a profession of how do we include as many people as possible.
Yeah. Very nice. Thank you very much. I think before the first panel is finished, I always think that the challenge we have in our profession is that one, that we're in these institutions, we're based in these institutions that still functions from the times of the Middle Ages, right? In some aspects of how we do business. And if we're truly going to be an anti-racist profession, do we need to just blow up the profession and start anew? Or can we, it's the same with the police. Can we really sort of make the police anti-racist? Can we truly make the child welfare system as it's currently set as an anti-racist institution without a whole major paradigm, a whole shift about how business is done from the ground forward? That was a question, I guess, and also a Kate Cross's comment. Alexis?
Well, so I think as many of us think probably on this panel is that these systems are working exactly as they are intended to work, right? They're not broken. So you can't fix what's not broken. And so, reforming, it's not the answer that I'm looking to. It is transforming, and abolition seems to be the path, because it is, all of these institutions, every institution in the US is rooted in white supremacy and racism. It's how it began. It's how our country began. It was in our founding documents. So, so there's really no way to make, in my opinion, to make a machine that was designed to dehumanize all of a sudden make it so that it's humanizing. Yeah. So I think it is about finding ways to not only dismantle, but to suggest the alternative and to rebuild. And that work is being done, as Anna mentioned. So that's, I'll stop there.
So Alexis, I'm going to give you the last word because we're going to have to close out this session. I, again, want to thank all of you for the wonderful work you're doing. And I truly safely can say that, our profession is in good hands with thinkers such as you. So we look forward to all of the wonderful work that you'll be doing moving forward. And hopefully this is just the start of a journey for us to really begin to make the changes we need to make in our profession to address the bigger issues of our society. So thank you, all of you, and the best of luck to you. And again, thank you again for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And so before I turn it over to Alan Detlef, the Dean at the University of Houston, I just want to remind everyone that that you can go back and view any of the presentations from today and yesterday, as well as part 1 and part 2 at the University of Houston website. There's a link there that all these presentations are available. I noticed in the chat that a few people were wondering if there's some ways that people can get together and have continued discussions. Hopefully that will be able to happen. If you need more information from any of the presenters, that their names and the programs are available in the links. So, and now I will turn it over to my colleague, Dean Alan Detlef, to close us out. Thank you, Alan. Good to see you. And I am moving off the stage. Take care.
Thank you, James Herbert. And also thank you to Dean Crew for facilitating an excellent panel this morning. What an amazing 2 days of presentations. We've had some incredible presentations over these last 2 days. And I want to once again thank all of our presenters for being a part of this important conversation, and thank all of you for watching and participating, and particularly all of those of you who've been with us on this whole journey throughout the year. You know, as I've reflected on the last 2 days and listened to the sessions that have been presented, we've heard over and over again our panelists speak to the harms that result from the carceral systems that social work as a profession continues to support. We've also heard how deep the problems of racism and white supremacy are within our systems, and the need for radical change to occur if we're truly going to expect different outcomes. As we opened the symposium yesterday, I read the names of the many Black men who've been murdered by the police since the murder of George Floyd. Despite all of the unrest and awakenings that occurred this past summer, the police have continued to murder Black Americans. And across these deaths, a common factor has been the lack of accountability for the officers responsible for these murders. 2021 began with news that the police officers involved in the shooting of Jacob Blake, which left him paralyzed from the waist down, would not be charged with any crime. This followed news from earlier this fall, in which a grand jury in Louisville, Kentucky, declined to file charges against the officers who were responsible for the murder of Breonna Taylor. This makes me think, for all of us as social workers, it's important to keep in mind that when we see this happen, this is not evidence of a problem. As you just heard our last panelists suggest, this is evidence that our system of policing, our carceral systems, are working exactly as they were intended. When a police officer murders or paralyzes an innocent person and faces no accountability because an investigation done by the police determines that those officers, quote, followed the law, that tells you everything you need to know about the law and about the police. So then, as social workers, what is the justice we seek? I've thought a lot about this over this past year. And for me, I've come to the conclusion that justice is not something that is even achievable. Justice for Breonna Taylor is a living, breathing Breonna Taylor. Justice for Jacob Blake is a healthy, walking Jacob Blake. Anything else is not just. So then what can we expect from accountability? And can we expect accountability when we have a system that holds the responsibility for investigating itself when harm is done? So again, I've come to believe that this is also not something we can achieve. We cannot expect accountability from a system that was designed from its inception to oppress and control Black people. So I'm no longer interested in accountability. I'm interested in prevention. And by prevention, I mean eliminating the possibility of the police murdering another Black American. And eliminating that possibility will only come when we eliminate the police. It's also important to point out that when people talk about eliminating the police, when people talk about eliminating carceral systems and the carceral state, that includes the child welfare system, which I and others refer to as the family policing system. As you heard earlier today,
this system systematically and disproportionately surveils, polices, and separates Black children from their parents, and then exposes those children to an intervention, foster care, that is known to cause harm. So when a system disproportionately separates Black children from their parents, and then subjects those children to an intervention known to cause harm, the system itself becomes a mechanism of their oppression. But also when we think about family separation, it's important to acknowledge that separating Black children from their parents has been happening since the beginnings of slavery as a means of maintaining power and control over Black people. So can we as a society really continue to sanction the forced separation of Black children from their parents in a racist society, knowing all we know about the deep problem of racism that exists in child welfare systems? So first, this practice of forcibly and involuntarily separating children from their parents needs to be understood from the history from which it came. And then the trauma this practice continues to produce must lead to a demand that this practice ends. And we as social workers need to be demanding it. As we heard earlier today, reforming the child welfare system has been tried and it has not worked. And that is because reforms cannot right a fundamental wrong. The only solution to the harms the child welfare system perpetrates on Black families is complete abolition of that system and a fundamental reimagining of how we as a society strengthen and support children and families. So I think back to how Dean Crew began our session yesterday with the words of Dr. Ronald Walters, who asked us to interrogate ourselves when we think about our work. What does this have to do with the liberation of Black people? And that makes me think, as social workers, we have to be clear in our goal. We've talked throughout these 2 days about dismantling racism and white supremacy, and that is what we need to be talking about and doing as social workers. But we need to be clear that the need for dismantling racism and white supremacy is to achieve our goal, and that goal is liberation. And liberation cannot exist within a carceral state. So I've invited some guests today from a newly launched movement for social workers, the Network to Advance Abolitionist Social Work. Please help me welcome Caitlin Becker and Michelle Greer to the stage. Caitlin and Michelle, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely.
Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start, your network is very new and is probably unfamiliar to a lot of our viewers. So can you start by telling us what is the Network to Advance Abolitionist Social Work?
Sure. So again, thank you for having us. Michelle and I are well acquainted with the family policing system, and we're just commenting that we're so grateful that the closing of this important conference ends with highlighting the ways in which social workers have been involved in and facilitating family separation in that system. We have both worked with families closely in that system and appreciate that that is a central part of the conversation here. So the Network to Advance Abolitionist Social Work is a collection of social workers across the country practicing in various settings. Some of us are academics, researchers, advocates, and direct practitioners. And we all recognize the ways in which people are criminalized and policed by these various systems, and that social workers have historically and today played a part in and at times led that policing effort. And so we're undertaking a year-long initiative to support the important work that is happening around the country as it relates to abolition and social work. We're trying to contribute to a dialogue around abolitionist values and social work, and to create a centralized place for resources for social workers and those who are impacted by social work to learn more about abolition, criminalization, and social work.
Excellent. And what can you say, what do you hope to achieve? You said it's a year-long project. What do you hope to accomplish through the work of the network?
Right. So as you said, we're a newer group, but we're not newer in our work. And I just want to name that there are so many folks that we honor and work alongside in this, and really feel that it's critical at this moment while there are conversations calling for defunding the police, recognizing the implications of social work within that. And so we hope to build community, engage in critical dialogue, and share our resources and our best practices. Many of us have been in the field for over
10 or so years, and just being able to name the ways in which we've done that and bring some of our friends along in that conversation. We hope to provide political education around abolition and social work, directly working with folks who are students right now and those entering the field, being able to name those things and see those things and have tangibles for when they walk away from their 2 years or more in social work school. We have a mapping project. We've created a survey to draw connections between practice, social work practice, criminalization, and abolition. We really hope that everyone here will take the survey and folks from across the country so we can understand what it's looking like for folks on the ground and then be able to offer that information back. And finally, we have a website, which is a work in progress, always, as these tend to be. And we're going to be beginning to add our content to this website and centralize resources from social work and abolition. So we know that there are tons of resources out there already, really thinking through the ways that this looks in social work practice. We have a few heroines that we name in this work, thinking through like Ida B. Wells and our African-centered, Indigenous-centered practitioners. And so wanting to also highlight their work there.
Excellent. So then you mentioned your website. How can people, what is your website and how can people get involved beyond going to the website and looking at the resources available there? What are other ways that people can get involved?
So our website is our acronym. So you can find us, and we'll make sure to put this in the chat so it's very easily accessible, but you can find us at www.nasw.com. And we're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Abolitionist Social Work. So the social work is Abolitionist SW, and those are going to the chat.
So at Abolitionist SW on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Yes, that's right. And we've got a couple of events coming up in March. And so we've just finished our first event for political education. So that video will be up on our website. We've got another one coming up on focused on harm reduction on March 31st. And we're going to be doing some Twitter conversations on every Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. And that I don't really know that much about Twitter, but I'm told that it's an opportunity to really engage in dialogue and conversation on Twitter. And we're going to be doing some Instagram lives 8 p.m. Wednesdays in March, Eastern Standard Time. And so we hope you'll join us for those conversations and keep an eye out on our website and our social media for more information about events to come.
Excellent. And if anybody didn't catch all of that, this is all at, the easiest place would be to go to the website, naasw.com.
Yes, that's correct.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I think this is a resource that's going to be very valuable to social workers. I've seen over the past year with my own students and just in conversations with many people, social workers wanting to learn more about this work. At all different stages, social workers who have already identified as abolitionists, but many social workers new to this movement, wanting to learn more, wanting to learn how to be involved. And I think it helps having a like-minded or a group of social workers to consider what this means, particularly for our profession and our role in these carceral systems and what that means for us as social workers to be abolitionists, given the spaces that we've occupied historically. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I also want to, so in addition, so great, visit naasw.com for more. I also want to mention that NASW, the National Association for Social Workers, is hosting a 2-part town hall on abolitionist work starting next Friday, March 12th. That Laura Abrams and I will be moderating, featuring many people from the Network to Advance Abolitionist Social Work. Mm-hmm. So we'll be learning more about that there. The first event is Friday, March 12th, and then the second one is going to focus on creating the change we wish to see on April 9th. But we'll be sharing more about that on our social media channels as well. Thank you both for being here, Caitlin and Michelle. I really appreciate it. And again, thanks to all of you for being part of our event for these past 2 days. One last reminder to join us for our last event in this symposium, part 4, on achieving racial justice through social work education on April 15th and 16th. Same place, our YouTube channel will be sharing a registration link in the coming weeks. Thank you all for being here. Thank you again to my amazing co-leaders and to the incredible staff at the University of Houston and at UCLA for helping with all the behind the scenes work. We couldn't do any of this without you, so I really appreciate all of you. Thank you all very much.